delete it, delete it. No, I'm just okay. I'm just joking. Okay. You can turn this on. You can turn this speaker on. All right. You can hear me. You need to turn it up a little bit more. Turn my volume up a little bit more, Guru. Turn the beat up some more. Turn the vocal up some more. You can hear me? Alright. How well can you hear me from right here? You can hear me real well from right here? How well can you hear me? Okay. This one a little bit more sensitive. This one I gotta be closer to my face. Okay. We're still working out with the Kings, day 3. We're reading They Can't Kill Us All by Wesley Lowery. We're on chapter 5.
Let us know if there's an echo too, since we got
Yes. Oh, that's a good point. That is a good point. If there's any type of echo, I don't think there's anybody watching right now. I don't think there's anybody watching right now.
Get on and let us know. Somebody, we're live. We're live.
Okay, relax. Let's check it out. How we doing? All right, it don't sound bad. It don't seem like there's no type of real bad echo or nothing. Okay. We're gonna keep going. If there is any type of echo, and you're reading this, or you're listening to this, leave some type of comment at the end. Leave some type of comment. We can change it. Again, reading "They Can't Kill Us All" by Wesley Lowery. We're on chapter 5. Chapter 5 is titled Charleston, Black Death is Black Death. On election night, 2008, as he took a Chicago stage to give his first address as president-elect, Obama credited the scores of young volunteers who were the backbone of his campaign, declaring that his efforts grew strength from the young people who rejected the myth of their generation's apathy, who left their homes and left their families for jobs that offer little pay and less sleep. "This is your victory," said the man who 2 months later would be inaugurated as the nation's first black president. The 2008 campaign by then-Senator Barack Obama inspired a generation of political activists and operatives on the left, mobilizing energetic and hungry young people who happily made change we can believe in, the first political rallying cry behind which they had ever aligned. That was especially true in battleground states like Ohio, Florida, and North Carolina, and among the ranks of young black political operatives who saw in the Obama campaign an opportunity for a milestone in the nation's civil rights history. The young black activists we know now, a lot of them began organizing through the Obama campaign, Bree Newsome told me in early 2016. We're talking about a generation of political participants that started out very enthusiastic about the process, and then, who by the time you get to Ferguson, had completely soured on the process. Real quick, we're down at Eddie Green Place, right down the street from City Hall. We're having breakfast. We got some donuts, some hot chocolates. Come grab some donuts. Come grab some chocolates. We're gonna be doing this tomorrow as well. Tomorrow, same thing type of tomorrow. We have breakfast tomorrow at 9 a.m. to about noon. 9 a.m. to about noon. Along with that, at 2 p.m. today, we'll be going around and putting the memorials back up and adding flowers and things like that. 2 p.m. today, right at City Hall, right at Say Their Name Square.
Make an announcement that we made it a half a year.
We have made it half a year.
Yeah.
In 2 hours. We made half. 9 o'clock this morning?
Yeah.
9 o'clock an hour ago. We have been here for 183 days. That marks, we've been here for half a year. For half a year we have been here. And through that time we have, there's been no easy day. There's been no easy day since we've been here. We're going to keep going, reading They Can't Kill Us All by Wesley Lowery. Born in Durham, Born in Durham, Newsom was raised in North Carolina and Columbia, Maryland, where she was class president at Oakland Mills High School 3 of her 4 years there. Next, she went off to film school at New York University. Of the most prominent Black Lives Matter activists, she is among those who most vocally proclaim her faith. Her father, Clarence Newsom, has for years served as a dean of Howard students. Has for years served as dean of Howard University's School of Divinity, and as with many of the other post-Joshua generation activists who had become the steady heartbeat of the Black Lives Matter movement, it wasn't until after the election of Barack Obama that Newsom became truly politically active. To understand it, we have to go back to the election of Barack Obama in terms of what that symbolized in terms of the hope. We saw that as us turning a corner in the country, Newsom told me. And then we saw through the Trayvon Martin case was that we haven't actually turned that corner. Honestly, Trayvon was a turning point. Trayvon Martin just had so many echoes of Emmett Till. It felt like something out of 1955. By the time of the protests and riots in Ferguson and Baltimore, Newsom told me, the movement had matured beyond the stage at which activists believed they had the luxury of working within the system, of coloring inside the lines. Black America had peacefully made its demands for justice after Trayvon Martin, and those cries had gone unheard. Now we talk about indicting the whole system. But back with Trayvon, a lot of people truly believed in the process. Newsom recalled, a lot of the protests back in 2012 were just about getting George Zimmerman arrested and tried. In 2012, it was about let the system work. The demand was for him to be arrested and tried. Well, he was arrested and tried, and then he was acquitted. Oh no. Zimmerman's acquittal further fanned the fires of protest. The Dream Defenders led a 31-day sit-in at Florida Governor Rick Scott's office, and Newsom was one of the dozens who traveled to Florida to join them. Million Hoodies began a national campaign aimed at media representation of black men. And a new group, #Black Lives Matter, began holding discussions about what coalition-based intersectional activism around the unique systemic threat to black bodies could look like. The year 2012 represented a turning point for Newsom and for her faith. She'd been raised in the church, but her personal commitment as an adult began manifesting itself through activism, which she saw as a part of her Christian charge to work on behalf of others. In 2013, the year after George Zimmerman was acquitted, Newsom moved back to North Carolina to help take care of her grandmother in Charlotte. What she found brewing in her home state was a historic voting rights battle that would consume her. She had no intention of becoming an activist, but to hear her tell it, she had little choice. In the wake of President Obama's re-election and the Tea Party movement that his presidency has sparked, North Carolina, in the midst of some of its most intense battles over voting restrictions that have played out in any state since the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Republican legislators, under the leadership of State House Speaker Tom Tillis, passed legislation requiring photo ID to vote, ending same-day voter registration and limiting the number of days allotted for early voting. In response, local activist groups led by the NAACP and Reverend William Barber II held massive protests throughout the state and at the State House, declaring the North Carolina law the worst voter suppression in the country and the worst one since Jim Crow. It was surreal, Newsom recalled. What struck me was that we were having this massive debate about the Voting Rights Act, something that I had thought was written in stone. Something that I thought was written in stone, that I thought was settled in history. Good. Maybe I had taken my rights too much for granted, she went on. If there was one thing I've always felt passionate about, it is access to voting. America, for all of its problems, I've always believed in our ability to vote and change our problems that way. Newsom joined the Moral Monday protests, which convened each week for rallies, sit-ins, and marches in opposition to recent state legislation that the activists argued was meant to do little other than make it hard for the state's black residents to vote. The battle in a state with a Republican governor and a GOP-run state house was always uphill. When it became clear that at least for now they were going to lose, many of the activists who had joined the coalition were forced to grapple with a brutal truth. Generations of voter registration drives and get out the vote efforts made little difference if access to the ballot box could be restricted or restructured so easily in such a politically partisan manner. It's a long way from electing the first black president to having your very right to vote replaced in jeopardy by Tea Party-inspired legislative bodies. And then the following year came Eric Garner, Michael Brown, John Crawford, and Tamir Rice. It was not just the killing of Michael Brown, it was the reaction from the police. It was seeing the police dogs and knowing the history there, Newsom said. Newsom knew of Rodney King and of the long-ago allegations of brutality by the New York Police Department. But Ferguson opened a new possibility in her mind, that the American problem of policing could in fact be as pervasive as the nation is broad and diverse. That if the police in Ferguson, Missouri were gunning down unarmed black men, this must also be happening everywhere else. That possibility was only reinforced in Newsom's mind as she watched incident after incident play out on the national stage. The deaths of Freddie Gray and the riots in Baltimore, the traffic stop of Sandra Bland and her death in a Texas jail cell, the viral video of an aggressive officer in McKinney, Texas, manhandling a black girl in a bikini, then pulling his gun on two boys who attempted to intervene. While these were almost always presented in the media as isolated, unrelated incidences, Newsom couldn't help but link each to the other, and connect them to her knowledge of the black struggle for justice and liberation that in America dates back to 1619. It's a modern iteration of a struggle that has existed for hundreds of years, Newsom said. Around Easter 2015, Newsom and her family traveled to South Carolina, where generations before, her family had been enslaved. They visited Rafting Creek Baptist Church, the congregation in Rembert, South Carolina, that her great-great-great-grandfather, Theodore Diggs, a former slave who could read and write, founded in 1864, near the end of the Civil War, along with 25 original members, primarily former slaves. It was a deeply spiritual experience for me, Newsom said, recalling the pain and perspective she found by tracing the lives of her ancestors. It was almost like I was being pulled there in anticipation of what was coming. 3 months later, on June 17, 2015, Newsom was at home, watching the local news, when she saw a breaking news alert flash across the bottom of her television screen. An active shooter was being reported, Emmanuel African Methodist at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Later, an update. Several people who had been attending a prayer meeting were dead, and the shooter was still at large. I was devastated, not just from the standpoint of my work as an activist or an organizer, but as a Christian, Newsom later told me. This was a prayer meeting. Somebody had knocked on the door, and they had let him in. He prayed with them, and then massacred them. Newsom couldn't stop thinking of the uncountable number of times her own family had gathered in a church sanctuary or meeting room for Bible study led by her father, or the refuge they had found in the confines of their church. She imagined the abiding feelings of safety that must have filled those worshippers, and how in an instant it would have been overcome with unthinkable terror. In tears, she called her older sister. I was up until midnight, reading every update I could find, Newsom recalled. I was just caught in this period of time, since I was awake at that late hour, where I was aware that everyone was going to wake up the next morning, and everything was going to be different. Ron Davis walked into the Washington Post building carrying 3 folded newspapers under his arm. For 3 years, Ron Davis and Lucia McBath had traveled the country telling the story of their slain son, Jordan Davis. Jordan Davis, the black teen who was killed by a white man in 2012 in a 2012 shooting in Jacksonville, Florida. Jordan's parents joined what would become a traveling tour of families mourning young black men and women killed by police by white vigilantes. They were in D.C. that day promoting a documentary about their son's death. Their next stop would be Charleston. Can you believe it? Davis asked me as he laid the newspapers on the conference room table and pointed at the images and headlines of horror and grief from Charleston. I'm headed down there later today, he said. It's just so heartbreaking. I couldn't believe it. Even though it had been several days since the massacre, 9 black Americans gunned down as they sat around a Bible study at the historic Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church. The gravity and the consequence of the shooting were evident, yet at the same time, not yet fully revealed. Unlike Bree Newsom, I'd had my phone turned silent that night, so I hadn't seen the news of the massacre until the following day. When I finally looked at social media that morning, I learned that the lives of 9 black Americans had been extinguished by a troubled traveler that had lovingly been invited into their midst. There was Sharonda Coleman Singleton, 45, whose son teased her that she went to church too much. DePayne Middleton Doctor, 49, whose powerful voice was known to fill the church rafters during hymns. And Cynthia Hurd, the local librarian who at 54 years old was described as being a stylish lady with a fierce shoe game. The oldest of the slain was Susie Jackson, 87, who just 2 weeks earlier had visited her grandkids in Euclid, Ohio, near Cleveland. The youngest was Tywanza Sanders, a 26-year-old barber who had posted photos from the prayer meeting to Snapchat just moments before the terror began. Ethel Lance, 70, was one of those church ladies who were a constant present at Emmanuel AME. She showed up on weekdays to clean the church grounds. She was among several of those killed who were Emmanuel's most faithful members. Daniel Simmons, 74, was a retired pastor himself, and Myra Thomas, 59 was a church trustee and the wife of the minister of another nearby congregation. Then there was Reverend Clementa C. Pinckney, the 41-year-old minister, the shepherd who died, doing what he did every Wednesday, leading his flock. He was a preacher. He was a teacher. He was about service, peace, and taking action, his grieving wife, Jennifer Pinckney, recalled during a speech memorializing her slain husband. He was a voice for the voiceless. Equally shattering was how familiar each of these names, faces, and story was. On my last night there, a reporter friend from the local newspaper convinced me to head out for a walk into historic Charleston. As we made our way down uneven brick streets, I couldn't pull my eyes from stone statues and other relics that dot White Point Garden, a park near the southernmost tip of the city. We passed a monument to Lucius Mendel Rivers, a congressman and ardent segregationist who routinely voted against civil rights and voting rights legislation. Next came the Daughters of the Confederacy Hall, which appeared to be a public building space that, according to paper signs posted, still hosted farmers markets and other public gatherings. As we walked deeper into the park, there were the cannons, placed near the water's edge, whose plaques declared that they were used by the Confederates to defend Fort Sumter. And off in one corner stood a massive monument, which seemed to depict a Greek soldier whose shield featured the South Carolina state seal. Behind the soldier stood a guardian angel. At the monument's base, an inscription: "To the Confederate Defenders of Charleston, Fort Sumter, 1861 through 1865." As a young man who had grown up almost entirely in the North, the pride with which the Confederacy still seemed to be so publicly celebrated gave me pause. "How do you stand in front of that statue?" I had written to a group of writer friends that night, and reconcile that it stands in honor of a man who died fighting to keep you considered less than human. On the first Sunday after the shooting, Emmanuel was filled to capacity. In one row sat Rick Santorum, a staunch conservative who at the time was hoping to win the GOP presidential nomination in 2016. Next to him sat DeRay McKenson, one of the dozen activists who had flooded the city in solidarity with those slain. Ron Davis was there too. While there are stark differences, the Charleston killings were a premeditated massacre, while Jordan Davis's death was a sudden, violent act. Davis's parents were struck by the underlying theme of white supremacy that ran through both incidences, as well as many of the other racial incidences that made headlines in the years between. Michael Dunn, then a 45-year-old software developer in town for a wedding, told jurors he was scared of Jordan Davis because he listened to rap crap, and his fiancée testified that when the two pulled into the gas station, the first words Dunn said were, "I hate that thug music." At one point during a jailhouse phone call, Dunn declared that he had to kill Davis. At one point during a jailhouse call, Dunn declared that he had to kill Davis before the teen killed somebody else. Dylan Roof, who faces the death penalty as the alleged shooter in Dylan Roof, who faces the death penalty as the alleged shooter in Charleston, has told law enforcement that he walked into the Charleston church with the intention of targeting black worshippers. He said he hoped the shooting would prompt a race war, decrying black Americans as a plague that needed to be dealt with. He somewhere got into his head that he hates black people and he wants to kill them. Where do you get that at 21 in your head? Said Ron Davis. I told Jordan that there are people out there like that. I don't think our kids really believe that. I don't think our kids really believe that this world is so messed up that there are people really like that. And unfortunately, he had to learn the hard way that there are people really like that. Ron Davis and Lucia McBath hadn't planned to be in Charleston. In fact, they were in the midst of a national tour to promote the documentary 3.5 minutes, 10 bullets.
Want to see if anybody want to read?
Yeah, no, I'm good. I was going to finish out this chapter.
Okay. Yeah. We're going to finish the chapter, and then if anybody else want to read, we'll have people add.
They were in the midst of a national tour to promote the documentary 3.5 minutes, 10 bullets, which follows the 2 trials it took to put Dunn behind bars for their son's death. But the tragedy in Charleston rocked them to their cores. They knew where they needed to be. Our story is just one of the many threads that thread through the larger problem of how we view race, guns, violence. Sorry, I got a bug. Our story is just one of the many threads that thread through the larger problem of how we view race, guns, violence, bias, McBath said. Every one of these stories, they're also completely relevant for what we have had to deal with within this country. Every time there is a story, there's another thread. For so long, these have been our stories. They've never been told outside our communities. The tie that binds Trayvon Martin to Jordan Davis, to Michael Brown, to Tamir Rice, to Clementa Pinckney. Clementa Pinckney is a hazard of black skin. In each case, an innocuous behavior, walking home in the rain, carrying a packet of Skittles, sitting at a gas station, listening to music, jaywalking on a suburban side street, playing with a toy gun in a park, or sitting around a church table for a prayer meeting, suddenly leads to a fatal encounter, seemingly only because the person involved was black. While some have argued that the Charleston shootings should be viewed in isolation, separate from the police shootings that have prompted protests during 2014 and 15, and the vigilante shootings of Trayvon Martin and Jordan Davis before them, others have argued that they are all undeniably linked. Our stories represent a whole magnitude of stories that have never been told in this country. All of black people who didn't get justice, McBath said. The nation would again turn its eyes to Emmanuel AME Church the following week, when President Obama traveled to Charleston to deliver the eulogy at Reverend Pinckney's funeral. The Bible calls us to hope, to persevere and have faith in things, to preserve and have faith in things not seen. President Obama began, standing flanked by black clergy cloaked in purple. They were still living by faith when they died. Scripture tells us they did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. We are here today to remember a man of God who lived by faith, a man who believed in things not seen, a man who believed there were better days ahead, off in the distance, a man of service who persevered, knowing full well he would not receive all the things he was promised, because he believed his efforts would deliver a better life for those that followed. Most striking in Obama's words that day were the dual meaning. They told the story of the slain reverend, who by age 13 was preaching behind a pulpit, and by 23 had begun serving in public office, serving as a state representative and later a state senator. They told the story of the reverend, who was remembered as a fierce advocate for his flock, who fought for access to health care and new resources for the poor, despite the political winds blowing in opposition. But the president was also speaking of himself, telling the story of a young, idealistic politician who had ascended to the Democratic perch of the presidency on the promise of hope and change. He was speaking of himself as a man who had sold the country on the promise of a better America, who, in face of radicalized attacks, not only on his policies, but also on his very legitimacy as an American and as a Christian, had dared the nation to look into the future toward even better days. In his speech to the mourners in Charleston, Obama drew the same parallels Jordan Davis' parents have. These slangs were, in fact, linked to the centuries-long assault on the black body. For too long, we've been blind to the way past injustice continue to shape the present. Perhaps it causes us to examine what we're doing to cause some of our children to hate. Perhaps it softens hearts towards those lost young men, tens and tens of thousands caught up in the criminal justice system, and leads us to make sure that that system is not infected with bias, that we embrace changes in how we train and equip our police, so that the bonds of trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve make us all safer and more secure. But Obama has never described America as fundamentally broken, or as a country that will forever pay the wages of its original sin. Obama has consistently preached an ideology of America exceptionalism that holds that this nation's greatness is derived not from its present state, but from the promise of what is to come. Unlike politicians who through rhetoric pine for some alleged greatness of years past, Obama keeps his belief in America's greatness in the reality of shortcomings and injustice of generations past, and premises it on the hope of a greater America yet to come. On election night 2008, he declared that that's the true genius of America, that America can change. 4 years later, having been re-elected after a long campaign in which his citizenship and faith were again questioned, he evoked the doctrine once more. Tonight, in this election, you, the American people, reminded us that while our road has been hard, while our journey has been long, we have picked ourselves up, we have fought our way back, and we know in our hearts that for the United States of America, the best is yet to come. Damn. I'm sorry, this chapter is a little bit longer than I thought. So if anybody does want to come up and read, just come up, pick off right here. You want to come up and read? Okay, we're on page 179. We're right here. And whenever you want to stop, go ahead and stop. I'll offer it back up. Okay.
good morning, you guys. Just to let you know again, we're reading They Can't Kill Us All, the story of the struggle for Black lives by Wesley Lowery. Here's the book. It's an ideology that has often been critiqued by the young Black Lives Matter activists who came to prominence toward the end of Obama's term in office. They heard in Obama's words the condescending, moralizing... That one? Okay, let me turn this way then. Okay, we'll start over. It's an ideology that has often been critiqued by the young Black Lives Matter activists who came to prominence towards the end of Obama's term in office. They heard in Obama's words the condescending, moralizing, and equivocating of a politician who had long abandoned his activist roots. President Obama's time in office would never see the post-racial America that so many had assumed his presidency would usher into existence, and he knew that. On that first election night in 2008, he declared, "This victory alone is not the change we seek. It's only the chance for us to make that change." In his eulogy in Charleston, Obama said, "More than any particular policy or ordinary cause of things." That reservoir of goodness, Obama repeated. If we can find that grace, anything is possible. If we can tap that grace, everything can change. And as applause broke out, the President of the United States transitioned into a hymn, Amazing Grace. Clementa Pinckney found that grace, Obama declared when he had finished singing. He went on again to list the name of each of those killed by hatred's bullets that evening in Charleston. Through the example of their lives, they now passed it on to us. May we find ourselves worthy of that precious and extraordinary gift as long as our lives endure. May grace now lead them home. As Obama concluded, Bree Newsom, several hours north in Charlotte, turned off her television and headed to her car. The themes of forgiveness and God's amazing grace had resonated with her, as had the faces of those slain, which reminded her of her own church family. And she believed in the audacious hope in each line of the president's plea. But if that day was one for hope, the next would be a day for action. Earlier that week on Tuesday, Bree Newsom had been one of about 10 activists who had hatched a plan at a meeting convened in Charlotte, living room by Todd Zimmer, an environmental activist who had previously protested in Charlotte. The group was a mixture of racial justice activists and several local environmental activists. They all agreed they had to do something. The shootings of the Charleston Nine had rocked them each to the core. And the fact that Reverend Pinckney's body was laying in state in a building that proudly displayed the Confederate battle flag on its grounds, they felt, was a deranged insult to the slain minister's humanity. By honoring a flag flown by an army that had fought to keep his ancestors enslaved, South Carolina was making an unspoken declaration of how little it valued Reverend Pinckney's life. The flag had first been placed above the South Carolina State House in 1961, as the nation began an intense, decade-long debate about desegregation and civil rights. Allegedly, the flag honored the 100th anniversary of the start of the Civil War. For years, activists, led by the NAACP, have argued that the reinstatement of the flag in South Carolina, as well as a wave of Confederate memorials, flags, and markers that popped up in the 1960s, was little more than a racist backlash against the civil rights movement, and have demanded that they be removed. The fact that we were even having this conversation embodied why we're in the streets saying Black Lives Matter, Newsom told me. It shows why it's necessary to say it. It reinforces the truth that we live in a society built on devaluing Black life. Newsom speaks with the calm confidence of a grade school teacher going over her lesson in front of a class of eager pupils. Many of the activists who have found platforms during the Obama years overflow with the fire of the righteously indignant, speaking with the voice of an oppressed people who will no longer sit silent. But Bree Newsom speaks truth with a steadiness of temper and tone that attests to the veracity of what she says, enticing you not with soaring rhetoric or emotion, but through thoughtful measure. What hit me was not just the massacre, said Newsom, who could still remember the feeling of disgust churning in her stomach when, after public debate, the Confederate battle flag was moved from atop the South Carolina State House to a monument just outside of it. It was the lack of leadership, the lack of moral leadership. Each of the activists gathered that day in the Charlotte living room wanted the flag to come down and believed that a disruptive protest in which they forcibly took it down themselves could swing momentum in the ongoing debate about Confederate symbolism. Next came figuring out who would be the one to take the flag down and how they would do it. We needed to raise morale and to rally the movement. We were really devastated at that time and those immediate days after the massacre. I remember being at a vigil the day after, and there was just this absolute feeling of devastation and shock, Newsom recalled. We felt that it was an important statement to make, that it would force a crisis moment, forcing South Carolina at that moment to either leave it down or raise it back up. Initially, they considered a covert nighttime operation with the hope of minimizing the likelihood that those who removed the flag would be accosted by onlookers or Confederate flag sympathizers, or harmed by the police who guard the State House. But ultimately, that wasn't the message they wanted to send. There was no reason to hide our action in darkness, Newsom said. We're on the side of justice. We didn't need to be ashamed or hide our actions. The next tactical hurdle was more logistical. They had to figure out who in the group could afford to be arrested. It's a conversation commonplace in activist circles as they plan direct action protests, figuring out who can afford, physically and financially, to be taken into custody for the cause. Mothers and fathers responsible for the daily care of children, those with prior legal records, and those employed at places that may not take kindly to one of their employees requiring a new mugshot will all be ruled out. In Ferguson, during the early protests, several of the activists with the largest social media followings, Ned Elsie and DeRay McKesson among them, often deliberately avoided arrest, reasoning that they would serve a greater purpose by documenting the scenes of other protesters being shackled and tear gassed than if they themselves were taken into custody. During Ferguson October, dozens of clergy members, led by Cornel West and Jim Wallace, crossed the police line in the parking lot of the Ferguson Police Department, an act of civil disobedience meant to prompt their arrests, while other activists, many of them young locals who might have had unpaid speeding tickets that could result in pending warrants, or who were more likely to lack the funds to bail themselves out, continued chanting behind them. At the Charlotte meeting, several of the activists were immediately ruled out. Newsom had no hesitation. She'd studied the history of nonviolent disobedience, read the writings of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., and knew the value of disruptive protest. She had also been arrested before, during the Moral Monday protests over voting rights. If the state of South Carolina would not take down this flag, she would take it down for them. Next began her preparation. Newsom and her partner, James Tyson, another Charlotte-based activist, began to train. An activist friend they knew in New York traveled down to North Carolina to teach Newsom how to climb. Next, the pair found a local school and spent hours practicing on the flagpole out in front. When summer classes were in session during the day, they would find light posts on secluded side streets and resume practicing there. It's critically important that white people actually put some skin in the game, Tyson told Democracy Now!, the nonprofit interview program, not long after the protest. Racism is unacceptable. White supremacy is unacceptable. The full group met in an IHOP near Charleston before dawn the morning after President Obama delivered Reverend Pinckney's eulogy. There was a KKK rally scheduled for the State House later in the day, so they decided the flag would need to come down early in the morning to protect Newsom from attack by any white supremacists who happened to arrive early. Fellow activists posing as joggers or sitting in cars pretending to read served as lookouts for police and other threats. Meanwhile, Newsom and Tyson remained at the restaurant. After 45 minutes of waiting, they got word via text message the coast was clear. Another activist dropped them off near the State House, and Newsom and Tyson began to move toward it at a pace somewhere between a walk and a jog. They knew Newsom would need to catapult herself up at least 15 feet up the pole to be safely out of the reach of the police. They reached the flagpole, and Tyson carefully helped Newsom over the 4-foot fence that surrounds it. That fence, installed by the State House after an attempt by activists years earlier to remove the flag, would serve as a vital protection for Newsom. But the police couldn't get to her without climbing over the fence themselves. She shimmied higher, foot by foot. With the lowest corner of the flag just out of her reach, she heard the voices of the police officers who had begun to respond. "Ma'am, ma'am," they yelled, "get off the pole. Ma'am, come down off the pole." But just moments later, she had reached the top, had unhooked the flag, and was holding in her right hand her left arm wrapped tight around the flagpole. "It was personal to me as a matter of faith to show defiance in the face of fear," Newsom told me months later. "I was feeling the struggle of millions of people who over hundreds of years, and with James standing guard beneath me, I was feeling the racial solidarity of our white allies from the abolitionists until now in this fight. It was a reminder that we're not in this alone." Moments later, she descended the flagpole, reciting scripture as she lowered herself into the arms of two officers who placed her and Tyson in handcuffs. As the two were taken to a patrol car, their fellow activists emerged, chanting the words of Assata Shakur, a former Black Panther that were among the most commonplace rallying cries of the Black Lives Matter activists. "It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains." Just 45 minutes later, the Confederate battle flag was again raised outside the State House. And even before much of the national media had taken note of Newsom's protest, its cameras would be focused on dozens of angry white supremacists gathered in front of the State House. What was the point? Skeptical commentators were quick to ask. They're just going to put the flag right back up, they argued. But Newsom had succeeded in creating that crisis moment. In a battle that at points had felt fruitless, the momentum had begun to shift. The next week, when legislators began to debate a bill that would remove the flag from the State House grounds, the mood had clearly changed. Think about it for just a second. Our ancestors were literally fighting to continue to keep human beings as slaves and continue the unimaginable acts that occur when someone is held against their will, declared State Senator Paul Thurmond, the son of famed segregationist Strom Thurmond, who had represented South Carolina for 48 years. I am not proud of that heritage. On July 10, 2015, the flag that Bree Newsom had removed came down again. Chapter 6. Ferguson again. A year later, the protests continue. Kayla Reed never intended to be an activist. In fact, on August 9, 2014, she was on the clock at the first of her two jobs as a pharmacy technician. Reed was St. Louis born and bred and a proud graduate of Riverview Gardens High School, one of 3 public high schools in which Ferguson children may end up enrolled. Her graduating class, the class of 2008, had been the last students to walk the stage before the school lost its accreditation. Next up for Reed was St. Louis University, where she had studied nursing, but it soon became clear to her that a medical career wasn't for her. She did fine in the classes, but didn't enjoy them. Maybe she should pursue the public service, she thought. In the meantime, she began volunteering with a program that mentored high school students and picked up 2 jobs, one at the pharmacy and the second at a furniture shop. On that day in August 2014, a coworker arrived comically late, and when asked why, explained that all hell had broken loose. She lived in the Canfield Green apartment complex in Ferguson, and the police had shot someone. Reed didn't go out to Canfield that day. Later that weekend, at the beckoning of her friend Tef Poe, the local rapper who would soon become one of the faces of the protest, she did. When she arrived, she stood stunned, staring at the same police dogs, armed officers, and tear gas that would soon mobilize thousands across the country. As she stood watching the chaos that played out night after night on Ferguson's streets, Reed tried to think of ways she could help the people she saw, who were so hurt and so angry. Her curiosity ignited, she too kept coming out night after night. What kept bringing me out was that the police were just not letting people hold space, gather in the street and on the sidewalks. For a young man who had just lost his life, Reed recalled. People were being tear-gassed and people were running. There was that fear and then also the determination not to back down, to show back up the next night. That was really inspiring for me. A few weeks later, Reed was helping lead the chants outside the Ferguson Police Department each night. Indict, convict, send that killer cop to jail. The whole damn system is guilty as hell. It was some time before the grand jury decision as she watched another night of protests end with arrests and confusion, when Reed decided it was time for her to become more formally involved. We need to do something more than just show up. We've got to get organized, Reed recalled thinking. She began organizing meetings with other young protesters. Ned Elsie, DeRay McKesson, Brittany Packnett, Tef Poe, Tori Russell, and others. They started sharing information about upcoming protests and comparing tactics. Essential, they all agreed, was not losing the momentum. But equally important, Reed knew, was finding ways to support the young people who had flooded the streets. Many were underemployed, underhoused, and underfed. These young would-be activists, these black residents of Ferguson and St. Louis County who had been crucially responsible for her awakening. How might she now pay them back? In that moment, I realized that I could do more than just be there and lead a chant. I could be a part of a bigger strategy, and I could be part of the group of people who were envisioning what this movement could be. By the time the media descended on Ferguson again, 1 year later, in August of 2015, Reed had become one of the enduring presences on the ground. She served as a primary point of contact for activists seeking housing and began working full-time with the Organization for Black Struggle, a local activist group that often charged her with representing the demands and passions of the streets in meetings with nonprofits and elected officials, what she had described as the non-romantic work behind policy change. Activists titled the first anniversary weekend United We Fight and planned massive marches and rallies to commemorate the day Michael Brown died. On the afternoon of August 9, 2015, thousands packed the street that snakes through the Canfield Green apartments, pausing with solemnly bowed heads for 4.5 minutes to remember the 4.5 hours during which Michael Brown's body had lain on the ground. It was a moment of solidarity after what had been a year of anxiety, anger, and among the activist ranks, internal discord. Several of the activists and activist groups who had been thrust into the forefront of the Ferguson unrest had 1 year later left the spotlight. Many who remained in St. Louis after the death of Mike Brown were angered as they watched the national media link them to hashtags Black Lives Matter. Many in Ferguson couldn't remember the activist network ever being a prominent presence on the ground. That conflation and other tactical and rhetorical disagreements caused infighting that often spilled over in public. For outside observers, it was not uncommon to perceive that the young people at the center of this activism had seized the spotlight only to get in a fistfight beneath it. 1 year later, Reed recalled, St. Louis was exhausted. Meanwhile, people nationwide were looking to replicate what the people in Ferguson did, but there was no blueprint for it. It was an organic moment. Standing near the front of the crowd that day on Canfield Drive was Tony Rice, who was perhaps Ferguson's most faithful protester. Since the early days of August 2014, Rice had been everywhere, at the protests, at the sites of police shootings, at the important meetings between activist groups, and constantly tweeting from his Search for Swag Twitter account. His omnipresence on the street continued for months after the cameras had left. How could he be everywhere, so much so that some journalists and fellow activists began joking that he must be the feds, and also managed to be right in the center of the action night after night? If and when something went down in Ferguson, Tony Rice's Twitter account was the first place to look for information. As I spoke with him over the course of the next year, Tony's enthusiasm gave way to dejected cynicism. He lived in Ferguson about 12 years, one of just a handful of local activists who actually lived within the city limits. When groups called marches, he would walk near the front, live streaming or posting video clips later. When the tactic changed to disrupting city council meetings, Rice was among the first to empty his pockets and walk through the newly installed Ferguson City Hall metal detector each night. When several activists began a petition to recall Ferguson Mayor James Knowles III, Tony Rice hit the streets with them, walking door to door for days to collect signatures. But as 2014 became 2015, Rice found himself lonely. The movement, birthed in Ferguson, soon left the small town behind. Too often, it seems, the eyes of the nation can gaze in just one direction. Once the grand jury had finished its work, the Ferguson activists found that the country was no longer hanging on their every chant. The terrible march of Black Death that followed the decision not to charge Darren Wilson, the deaths of Tamir Rice, Sam DuBose, Sandra Bland, and Walter Scott seized attention previously showered on those in Greater St. Louis, forcing newly minted activists and veteran activist groups alike to conduct their work in the shadows and without recognition. Netta Elzie, DeRay McKesson, and others like them had become national figures. They were giving talks around the country, sitting on discussion panels, and conducting media interviews, in addition to their work as activists. Brittany Packnett had been appointed to the state-level Ferguson Commission and the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. Others, like Reed, had joined legacy organizations in St. Louis, eagerly committing their professional lives to the same righteous indignation that had drawn them to the street protests. And others still were working to restabilize the lives they had upended to join the protests. "Some days I want to quit this movement," Alexis Templeton told me on the phone one day late in 2015. Well, a lot of days. A year before the protests began, on July 6, 2013, Templeton had been a passenger in a deadly car crash that killed her father, her uncle, and her partner. The survivor's guilt was almost impossible to shake and led to a debilitating 2-year depression fueled by constant flashbacks and a feeling of helplessness that comes with knowing that it's only by chance that you're still alive. "I didn't feel like I deserved to be here, and I didn't want to be here," Templeton said. On August 13, 2014, Templeton sat in an empty bedroom with a loaded gun in one hand, tears streaming down beneath the cold barrel pressed to her forehead. Even in that critical moment, she couldn't shake the images of protest pouring out of Ferguson. A childhood friend, the rapper The Pharaoh, had been among the first to tweet photos from the scene of Michael Brown's death. Templeton had watched intently, glued to her phone, as demonstrators were tear-gassed night after night. Next came the media coverage, and more tear gas. By that point, it had been going on for days. "Why not go outside," Templeton rationalized that day, "and see what this is all about? This gun'll still be here tomorrow." "I went outside, and I never came back in," Templeton later told me. Night after night, late into the night, she stayed out with the protesters, each passing hour further dispersing the demons left back in that bedroom. As the community of activists evolved into a de facto family, Templeton realized that these people and this fight were worth living for. Ultimately, Templeton met Brittany Farrell, a fellow activist who co-founded Millennial Activists United. The two fell in love, and by the time the Ferguson anniversary came around, they were married. "This movement saved so many lives," Templeton told me. Though jaded by the politics of organizing and frustrated by the infighting that had derailed what could have been many more alliances between prominent Ferguson protesters in the years since the unrest, Templeton saw the deaths of Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, and Sandra Bland as a crucial awakening, one with the power to restore life to those who had forfeited it. Their deaths could never be in vain because they had forced others to live. "If I had not been consumed, if I had not been so enraged by Mike Brown, I wouldn't be here," Templeton told me. "I attribute being alive to Mike Brown. Mike Brown saved my life." For most of the year after Michael Brown's death, my reporting focused on policing policy, tactics, training, best practices, and reform, with race serving as an ever-present subplot. My goal was and is to pull back the veil over a profession that had become among the least accessible and least transparent corners of government. The team I was with at the Washington Post worked daily to track police shootings, recording almost 400 fatal shootings by police officers during the first 5 months of 2015. In the meantime, we reported what I considered a stunning finding, that nearly 1 in 3 of these fatal shootings included mental illness as a factor. Soon we'd dive into deeply reported pieces on body cameras and on repeaters, officers who had previously been involved in fatal shootings who ended up shooting and killing again. But first, with the anniversary of Ferguson quickly approaching, we knew it was important to explore the role of race in police killings. After collecting data for half of a year, what we could say about the police shootings of black men and women, specifically when they were unarmed. Between January and August 2015, 24 unarmed black people have been shot and killed by police. While black men and women make up just 12% of the nation's population, they accounted for nearly 25% of those who were being shot and killed by the police. At the same time, a national conversation had taken hold about the demonization of black youth in the media. Among the first hashtags to trend nationally during Ferguson was hashtag If They Gun Me Down, in which young people of color posted photos of their graduations or with family members, photos that portrayed them in a positive light, next to photos that showed them partying or goofing off. The implication being that if they were to be killed by the police, the media would certainly frame their life using the less flattering images. On the day of Michael Brown's funeral, the feature on his life on the front page of the New York Times included the declaration that Brown was no angel. Tanya Brown could have told you herself that her son Brandon was no angel. It was one of the first things she said to me when I first spoke with her in July of 2015. Brandon Jones had always been big for his age and, according to his mother, had a learning disability, which resulted in some bullying in school from children intimidated by his size. As he got older, Brandon was embarrassed at how far behind he'd fallen in his classes, and as he approached high school age, he still lacked most advanced reading skills. Soon, he was no longer attending classes and was hanging around with the wrong types of kids from the neighborhood. It was after 2 one morning on March 2015, just a week before what would have been Brandon's 19th birthday, when a woman dialed 911 and informed the Cleveland Division of Police that she was watching as Brandon broke into Parkwood Grocery, the corner store across the street. Cleveland police said a struggle ensued when the two officers attempted to take suspect into custody, and that during the confrontation, one officer fired a shot from his weapon, striking the suspect. What he did was definitely wrong, Tanya Brown said. I'll say it until I'm in my grave. Hell no, he shouldn't have been there, coming out of that store hands full of cigarettes and change. But he should be incarcerated. My son shouldn't be in my dining room in an urn on the shelf. The case, like most police shootings, never drew the national spotlight. In fact, only once did the shooting of Brandon Jones win a significant round of media coverage, when the local police union announced it would auction off a gun to raise money for the officer involved. Because he committed a crime, it just seems like his death doesn't matter to anyone. You hear all this talk about unarmed individuals shot by the police, but when I speak about my son, those same people are like, who? Joan's mother told me, though, through tears, a life is a life, and a death is a death. What my son did was wrong, but that doesn't justify taking his life. Among the 24 black men shot by police in the first 8 months of 2015 were several exceptional cases, such as that of Sam DuBose, the black man shot and killed by University of Cincinnati police officer Ray Tensing, who had pulled him over and then ordered him out of the car after DuBose admitted he didn't have his license with him. The man refused. The officer pulled his gun. Seconds later, DuBose was dead. Tensing was wearing a body camera. For weeks, as prosecutors considered charges, the public clamored to see the tape. Many in Cincinnati felt that if they could still smell the smoke from the 2001 riots that engulfed parts of the city after a similar shooting there. But with video in hand, the local prosecutor announced he would charge the officer. I used to defend cops in these cases, Paul Cristallo, one of the attorneys working with the family of Brandon Jones, told me. Without video, nobody believes you. If there hadn't been that videotape, none of us would even know Rodney King's name. In the absence of a video, unfortunately, it's the officer's word against the unspoken tale of a dead person. Sam DuBose's death was a rarity, not only in that it had been caught on camera, but also in that Ray Tensing was charged with the crime. The shooting joined those of Walter Scott in South Carolina, Eric Harris in Oklahoma, William Chapman in Virginia, Anthony Hill in Georgia, and Corey Jones in Florida, as one of only 6 out of 248 cases of fatal shootings by police of black men in 2015 in which an officer was charged. In other cases, critics are quick to note, protests erupted in support of the slain only to be undermined by details that surfaced during the investigation. That was the case after Tallahassee police officer David Stith shot and killed Jeremy Lett in February of 2015. The shooting immediately drew local outrage, largely from Florida State University students involved with Dream Defenders, a group formed after the 2012 shooting of Trayvon Martin, who stormed the state's attorney's office demanding that Stith be charged. Protesters adopted the narrative that Lett, an assistant minister at a local church who had been standing outside an apartment building, had been racially profiled. Lett appeared to match the description of a burglary suspect when Stith approached him and a struggle ensued. Photos of Lett in a pinstripe suit and clerical collar soon circulated on social media. Police had been called at 8:08 that fatal night by John Kalman, who reported that Lett was knocking on his door, repeatedly demanding to see Kalman's roommate, Denise Skipper. Lett had first arrived an hour earlier, asking to speak with Skipper, but she was sleeping, so Kalman told Lett to come back another time. Lett then went to Skipper's bedroom window, banging on the glass, but that didn't earn a response. When that didn't earn a response, he went back to the front door at least twice more, banging with his fist. He used to live in this complex, was friendly, but haven't seen him around in about a year, Skipper wrote in her witness statement. This was totally unexpected, this visit from him. When Officer Stith arrived at the apartment, he later told internal affairs investigators he discovered Lett lying at the foot of the front stoop, seemingly drunk. He awoke Lett by shining a flashlight in his eyes. As Stith backed up, he said, Lett leapt to his feet, let out 3 loud screams, and then ran toward the officer who sidestepped him at the last moment. It's almost as if he anticipated trying to tackle me, Stith told investigators. He just bit in and went right into the grass. Lett then got up to charge again, and Stith said he attempted to use his taser but missed before again sidestepping Lett, who again fell to the ground. Stith tried once more to stun Lett with the taser, but the man threw the officer off his back. I'm thinking this ain't working out, and then I realize that the taser's tasing me in my right hand because of the rain, Stith said. As the officer reholstered his taser and drew his gun, Lett gave one more scream and charged again, prompting the officer to fire 1 shot. Then, according to Stith, Lett charged again, but this time Stith fell to the ground as he backpedaled. He said he kicked his feet up, preventing Lett from mounting him on the ground, and began firing a series of shots into Lett's chest. After his final shot, Stith said he thrust with his legs, forcing Lett off him and flat onto his back on the ground. Lett was dead, 5 bullets lodged in his body. The medical examiner later concluded that there was a significant amount of cocaine in his system. By the end of February, a Florida grand jury had concluded that Stith's actions were justified. I don't know what the fuck was wrong with this fucking guy, but he just started coming at me, Stith told one of the first officers to arrive on the scene after the shooting. Later, while speaking to a commanding officer still at the scene, he got emotional. I just kept firing because he wouldn't stop fucking coming, he said. For critics, cases like that of Jeremy Lett served as examples of the flaws in the ideology of the movement for Black lives. Didn't this man, or others like him, deserve to die? Wasn't his fate sealed by his own poor decision-making? But the protest chants were never meant to assert the innocence of every slain black man and woman. The protests were an assertion of their humanity and a demand for a system of policing and justice that was transparent, equitable, and fair. Who is a perfect victim? Michael Brown? Kajim Powell? Eric Garner? Sandra Bland? Freddie Gray? Young activists reframed the question, does it matter? For too long, many of the activists declared black bodies had been extinguished by police officers without public accountability or explanation. For all the stories of police abuse, brutality, and impunity that had been shared at black dinner tables, barbershops, and bar stools for generations, these basic facts went ignored or unacknowledged by the nation at large. It doesn't matter what race the cop is. It's about the culture of policing in America, Anthony Jordan, another of Tanya Brown's attorneys, told me. It's unquestionably a race issue. But it's not this cartoon image we get in our head of police officers going home and putting on Klan garb. It's about a culture that's devaluing black men. Unlike the civil rights generations before them, young activists on the front lines today refuse to poll test their martyrs, a practice they see as yet another bastion of respectability politics. Insisting that the burden of proof rests with the body of the slain black men or women is to argue that black life on its own does not matter. Clifton Kinney grew up in Spanish Lake, a neighborhood about 3 minutes from where Michael Brown was shot in Ferguson. Kinney's dad had worked at General Motors and was a brilliant man, he told me, but he was also an alcoholic, often emptying his wallet into the hands of bartenders and liquor store cashiers, even as his family struggled through poverty. Kinney is the third oldest of 8 children. On July 16, 2014, just a month before he was set to begin his senior year of high school, Kinney's mother died. It was 3 weeks later, as the 17-year-old battled the depression and crippling anxiety that plagued him after his mother's death, that he first saw the Instagram posts. He was sitting at home, scrolling through his phone, when he saw Michael Brown's body. At first he assumed it was a screenshot from a movie. There was no way a body would just be lying out in the street like that in real life. Then he saw the location, Canfield Drive. Soon text messages were pouring in from friends asking if he knew Mike Brown. He didn't. And asking if he was going to see what happened. I don't know what it was, that force, a combination of anger and tiredness. It pulled me out there, Kinney recalled. I stood out on the street for a half an hour and I witnessed everything. The police being aggressive toward the community, the dogs, the riot gear. Seeing his mother scream, seeing his body on the ground, it put me in a traumatized state again. It reminded me of my own mother, Kinney said. I had to drive home to gather myself. I had to think. Days later, Kinney and a friend joined the now bustling protests, only to be tear gassed and struck with rubber bullets minutes after arriving. At first I'm thinking that it's smoke, that something's on fire, so I stopped, dropped, and rolled, Kinney recalled with a laugh. And then all of a sudden my body is beginning to sting. The smoke is burning my nostrils. I couldn't breathe. I started to throw up, and then I began to cry. I wasn't crying because I was in pain. I was crying because I didn't believe that something like this could happen in America, that the police would harm me this way in America in 2014. That was the day Kinney became a protester. Hands up, don't shoot became his rallying cry, and not only because he believed that it had been among Michael Brown's final words. For the Ferguson protesters, it was much a personal plea as a rhetorical declaration. Please, they were screaming to the officers who responded to each protest, do not shoot us. Our hands are up. Before she died, Kinney's mother had fought to get him admitted to Lutheran High School North, a private Christian school not far from Ferguson. The public school he had been attending, Hazelwood East, had lost its accreditation. My mom always instilled in me that education came first, Kinney recalled, noting that even as she battled several rounds of cancer, his mother returned to college to get a degree in social work. She was too sick to work full-time, but she would do freelance social work, helping out friends and family members. I don't know who else would think to do it but my mom. I guess she was just an angel. As he sat in English class on August 13th, 2014, the morning after he'd been tear-gassed, and as I sat on a plane tens of thousands of miles overhead en route to St. Louis, his teacher began to riff about the ongoing protests. I wish those people would stop looting and burning stuff, Kinney recalled his teacher declaring. Kinney was stunned. He'd been at the protest the entire previous night. He had been hit with tear gas and rubber bullets, and as he stood peacefully chanting in a parking lot. But the condemnation he was hearing from a teacher was of the residents, not the police. The paralyzing shock he felt soon turned to mobilizing rage. He stood up and stormed out of the classroom. When he got home, he sent a group text message to dozens of friends at his school and others. They needed to do something, he said. They needed to join the protest and make people understand. He asked 20 friends to come to his place for a planning meeting. Each spread the word, and more than 50 people showed up. The coalition of high school students soon took the name Our Destiny STL and began co-hosting protests, joining the evening marches and chants organized by the older protest groups, and holding voter registration drives at local high schools, hoping to get as many 18-year-old high school seniors registered as possible. The students, the young people, we had to make a stance. Here we are in these schools right around Ferguson, and Mike Brown had just graduated from one. He was about to go to college, Kinney told me later. This case showed us that a high school degree wouldn't protect us from state violence. In November, Kinney organized a massive walkout, a larger form of his own personal protest, in which more than 800 students from St. Louis area high schools agreed to leave class and campus on the Monday after the announcement that Darren Wilson would not be charged. This at a time when much of the media was speculating that activism in Ferguson would be coming to an end. After all, the wait for the grand jury decision was now over. Most striking to me about Kinney had always been his level of introspection. He speaks with poise, confidence, and a wisdom far beyond his experience. It's unclear if the tumult of his teen years forced him to acquire this maturity, or if it was always there. When he speaks about his life and about Ferguson, he sprinkles in historical references, placing each rhetorical point in the context of racial justice leaders and movements of the past. What is clear with Kinney, more so than with many of the other young leaders who emerged since Ferguson, is that he is first and foremost a student. I used to learn all about those guys and women, and now we're here in our own civil rights movement, Kinney told me. I really have to sit sometimes and think about the time and the moment that we're in right now. It can be unreal. In February of 2015, Kinney's work to organize high school students near Ferguson was recognized with the Ambassador Andrew Young Distinguished Leader Award, and during his trip to accept the honor, the young organizer found himself seated next to Andrew Young, one of the civil rights giants he had studied so intensely. "Thank you," Young would lean in to tell the young man. "We're just continuing your fight. We're fighting your fight," Kinney responded. No, Young replied. "This is all of our fight. You are all just the next ones up. You are all the next leaders." Kinney had decided when his mother died that he would make sure he attended college. That had been her dream for him, and in the short time since her death, he had vowed not to let her down her legacy. Halfway through August of 2015, I got a call from DeRay McKesson. Kinney had chosen to go to Howard University, the school that had given him a prestigious scholarship, in part because of the organizing work he had done while in Ferguson, and a group of activists were going to help him move in. I met Kinney and the group on August 15th at Ben's Next Door, a bar and restaurant next to Ben's Chili Bowl on U Street in D.C. At the table were McKesson, Netta Elsie, Brittany Packnett, and Justin Hansford, who had spent the day treating Kinney like their own child, making sure he filled out the move-in forms correctly, making runs to Target and Bed Bath & Beyond for bedding, amenities, and a dorm's room's worth of snack food, and nudging him towards certain clubs and organizations that had booths set up near the center of campus. In the years since Michael Brown had been killed, these young leaders had found fame, notoriety, influence, and each other. For months, McKesson had preached to me that the power of protest is found in the communal space it creates, that by connecting marginalized people, the protest created a combined force that is powerful where singular voices would be weak. As the group debated an upcoming congressional race in Missouri, Kinney listened intently. At a pause in the conversation, he interjected, bursting with excitement as he detailed his plans for the upcoming year, that he was going to make sure he didn't lose the energy of Ferguson. He was going to find the right activist organization, he vowed, and would start his own if he needed to ensure that this moment continued. "The movement," he declared with youthful hubris as the rest of us at the table, "is coming to campus." Martese Johnson wasn't supposed to succeed. He wasn't supposed to become one of the most recognized leaders on one of the nation's most storied, predominantly white college campuses, and he wasn't supposed to become one of the faces of the movement. He grew up poor and black. He was raised by a single parent, and worst of all, he was from Chicago, the rough side. Johnson moved at least a dozen times as a kid, bouncing from home to home with his mother and two of his brothers, almost always on the south side of Chicago. These moves trace the struggles of a single mother working as a social worker who was trying against the odds to build a better life for her boys. The family moved from school district to school district, spending one semester in a predominantly Latino district in Chicago and the next in an almost all-white school across the state line in Indiana. By the time Artis was in middle school, the annual move to a new apartment and a new school had become normal. Nearly all the males he knew growing up were gang-affiliated, from the boys playing dice on the corner to the man behind the counter selling bags of fruit chew candy for $1. For many, the neighborhood gang was little more than a cliché, a pack of friends, a means of finding camaraderie and belonging in a lonely and underachieving sliver of the city. And with affiliation came a code, a set of rules that extended beyond the roster of self-proclaimed members and into the minds and actions of the rest of the boys in the neighborhood. It was really hard being that close in proximity to constant gang activity. It means that the gang mentality is really big for you as a kid. And with that comes the idea that we hate the police, that they're an enemy, Johnson told me, reflecting on his childhood. My mom would always tell me when I went out, no matter what the police said to me, don't say anything back and do exactly what they told me to do or I could lose my life. Johnson never joined a gang, but he never felt much need to go out of his way to avoid his friends who were affiliated either. The kids on the block, now dealing on the side, now carrying a piece, were his friends, his playmates. Staying cool with them didn't seem like something that would endanger him. If anything, he figured the proximity might keep him safe. When he was 13, just shy of high school, he was hanging out with one of these friends, a kid from the block who had been the standout in elementary and middle school for singing and the arts. He was a really good kid, Johnson recalled with a knowing chuckle. That he was affiliated with the local gang, that was part of just another facet to this kid. What Johnson didn't know as he stood on the corner with his friend and several others was that earlier that summer day, his friend had been involved in a drive-by shooting targeting a rival gang. As he and his friends stood outside their apartment building, the gang had been targeted earlier, had piled into a car, and was searching for them. Johnson can still see the car, which, with faded paint, pulling up slowly as he joked with his buddies. Almost in slow motion, the vehicle stopped, arms extended out the windows, and the silent stillness was shattered by the popping of gunfire. We all just scattered, Johnson recalled. I ran into the apartment building and crouched down in one of the breezeways until the shooting stopped. Then I ran home. When you grow up in that environment, being a gang feels so natural, said Johnson. But getting shot at was another level. That was not natural. That was not the life I wanted. It was a pivotal moment for me. It alluded to what my future could be, and I had always been a smart kid. That was the moment I decided to prioritize those smarts. Johnson was ambitious and driven. He excelled at Kenwood Academy, where his mentors pushed him toward business school. The summer before his senior year, they signed him up for a summer business institute at the University of Virginia, a school the young man with the soothing baritone voice had never even heard of before. Unable to make the basketball team, he picked up volleyball, which soon became his chief adolescent passion. He loved volleyball because it required skill and precision, unlike basketball and football, which could be dominated by kids who had been blessed with an early growth spurt. It was in high school that Johnson says his perception of the police began to shift slowly as well. To be clear, he still didn't completely trust them. But maybe they weren't the enemy. If he played by the rules and stayed out of trouble, he thought, they could be allies. He recalled for me that one day, in either his junior or senior year, he was followed and taunted by a few of the guys from the block. As part of his business leadership program, he wore a shirt and tie, which made him an easy and obvious target of ridicule as he made his way home through one of the city's roughest neighborhoods. Johnson said he tried to ignore the kids, but they kept following him. He got scared and broke into a jog. These kids just kept following, and eventually they rolled. At that moment, a police officer comes out of nowhere. The officer flashed his lights and blared his sirens, and the crowd chasing Johnson dispersed. He waved to the officer and finished his walk home. Up to that point, my only experience with the police was them coming up to me and my friends and harassing us. "Why are you outside? Shouldn't you have someplace to be?" I had always experienced what I considered biased policing, and here was a moment in which a police officer was actually helping me. It was such a big moment for me because it had never happened before. Johnson's dream was to go to the University of Southern California. During his high school years, he had been taken to rooting for USC in football and basketball, but when he visited campus, he found himself intimidated by Los Angeles. The designer jeans and vanilla lattes made the campus feel like a world far different from the one he was used to. The bright lights of Hollywood can be a shining beacon, attracting those from afar, but for Johnson they were more like the flashing brights that catch your eye in the oncoming lane. After committing to USC, he decided he wasn't ready for a move to Los Angeles. He had applied to and been accepted by more than 24 schools, but there was only one other on his list that he thought could work. That grassy campus on the East Coast where he had stayed in a dorm during his business institute in previous summer. Johnson called the admissions office of UVA and told them he was headed to campus. Freshman year is tough for most, and Johnson was no exception. He was the only black male in his dorm of more than 150 students, and it was hard for him not to perceive slights and insensitivities from some of his classmates, some of whom he soon became convinced had never before encountered a black person. Some of them started teasingly called him the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. "I'd walk into parties and everyone would be white. I'd stick out," Johnson said. Everyone would stare from across the room, and eventually someone would ask, "Do you go to UVA?" And those were just the parties he could get into. Often he'd be greeted at the door of an all-white fraternity and told he wasn't welcome. Things got better his sophomore year, when he decided to dive into the black organization on campus with the hope of finding friends with whom he had more in common, or who at the very least wouldn't tease him with his insensitive nicknames. He pledged a fraternity and joined the Black Student Alliance. By his senior year, he had been named to the Honor Committee, an elite student council that helps enforce the campus honor code and weighs in on student disciplinary matters. Of the 27 members of the council, he was the sole black student. Martise Johnson thought he was following all of the rules. He had made it out of Chicago. He had been admitted to an elite school, and he was now among the most recognizable leaders on campus. But as he'd soon learn, his individual accomplishment wouldn't keep his head from hitting the concrete, or keep the sharp sting of an officer's knees from finding the small of his back during the late hours of St. Patrick's Day 2015. He and a few of his friends hanging out on campus that night had decided to head to Trinity, a popular bar just off campus. As he approached the door, the owner asked for his ID. Johnson had lost his VA driver's license a week or two earlier, but had a second ID card from Illinois. What he didn't realize was that because of his Chicago ID was older, and given how often his family had moved, the zip code on that photo ID was different than the one on his driver's license. As the owner quizzed him, he gave the wrong zip code, so the bar owner turned him away. I walked away, and immediately I was grabbed from behind by a police officer. It was less than a minute before it escalated into 3 officers slamming me to the ground, Johnson told me. The officers, he believed, assumed he had been turned away from the bar for being underage and using a fake ID. As the officers held him on the ground, a gash opened on his forehead and blood began to trickle down his face, mixing with perspiration and tears. "I go to UVA! I go to UVA! How could this happen?" Johnson screamed to the officers, assuming they must have taken him for a local resident. "I go to UVA!" He recalled, "I was just wondering how this could happen. I felt that I had done everything I was supposed to do. I had checked all the boxes. I came from a rough background, but I had made it to somewhere better. I thought the police were here to truly protect us, and now at that moment I was surprised again. I never believed Charlottesville could be as bad as Chicago." Johnson was handcuffed and shackled and taken by police to a local hospital where 10 stitches would be sewn into his head. He spent the night at the police station, unaware that his name had already become a national rallying cry. As Johnson lay on the ground, the officers atop him, his friends had pulled out their cell phones and recorded video of his frantic screams. Once the video had posted online, it took just minutes for his shouts and pleas to go viral. Other students knew who he was and filled in the blanks for those following the story from afar. Here was a campus leader, thrown to the ground and wounded for having misstated his zip code. By the time he was released from jail the next morning, Johnson and 20,000 new followers on Twitter and 400 unread text messages in his phone. His name had been trending on Twitter overnight, with dozens of articles already written about the incident. He didn't want any of it. Frankly, he was embarrassed. He washed his face, put on fresh clothes, and went to an honor committee meeting, where he hoped to regain some anonymity. Instead, the other committee members immediately asked him what had happened, expressed their support, and sent him home to rest. Johnson faced 2 misdemeanor charges, public intoxication and obstruction of justice. Eventually, they would both be dropped. But Johnson's arrest and the viral videos that captured his pain prompted the next round of awakening. He had done everything right, and yet here he was, his head cracked open with 2 officers on his back. If this could happen to Martise Johnson, it could happen to any black college student. The incident served as a wake-up call to college students on campuses across the country. The privilege of education and the disguise of respectability can't protect you. Even on the nation's most elite campuses, your black body remains vulnerable. My situation was the one situation of those that sparked protests where the black man hadn't been killed. It shattered all aspects of respectability politics. I was a kid who did everything I was supposed to have done. I wasn't some weed-smoking gangster who didn't pull up his pants. I was a student doing what I was supposed to do, and I still ended up being harmed by police. It had been months since Martise Johnson's arrest. A summer had come and gone, but as black students flocked back to college campuses in the fall of 2015, they brought with them renewed energy. That summer had included the anniversary of Ferguson and the deaths of Sandra Bland and Samuel DuBose. While dozens of campuses would see protests, the most memorable was unsurprisingly at the University of Missouri. About 30 football players, all black, crowded the multi-purpose room near the back of the university's Gaines Oldham Black Culture Center one Friday night in November of 2014. Across from them sat Jonathan Butler. It had been 5 days since the 25-year-old graduate student had begun a hunger strike, and his fellow protest organizers were worried about him. The protest had drawn little notice initially, but as it approached its first weekend, national attention had slowly begun to shift to this university campus drop between St. Louis and Kansas City. By the following Monday morning, it would be the biggest story in the nation. Butler had been raised in Omaha, hailing from a prominent family of ministers and businessmen. Before Mizzou, he had gotten a degree in business administration, and now he was pursuing a master's in educational leadership. He had only recently become involved in campus activism and had described himself as an unlikely protester. Butler's demand was that the university president, Tom Wolfe, resign or be removed from office. Butler, like many black students at Mizzou and their allies, believed Wolfe was a derelict in his duty to ensure their safety in light of a spate of racial incidents. The University of Missouri, a majority white campus of 35,000 with about 2,500 black students, is a school at which, despite the small percentage of black students, racial activism has brewed for decades. Like many colleges in the Midwest, Mizzou features a student body that is a cocktail of races, political beliefs, and socioeconomic backgrounds. Overall, the campus is relatively liberal compared to the more conservative section of Missouri that surrounds it. A thick spirit of discontent had settled at the core of the black student body during the past year as they watched the unrest unfolding in the streets of Ferguson just 2 hours away. It took just 2 days from when Butler stopped eating for members of the football team to inquire about his protest. First, they wanted to know why he was doing it, a question they asked fellow members of Concerned Student 1950, a small but growing activist group at which he was a member, and which was named after the year when black students first successfully enrolled at the university. Then they wanted to know if they could help. Like many Division I athletes, members of the football team were segregated on campus in special dorms and had special course schedules. They felt removed from the rest of the student body as a whole, and from the rest of the black student body in particular, even though the majority of the team was black. If change was coming to Mizzou, or it seems nearly every black student knows of a friend, roommate, or professor confronted by racist taunts or slurs, they wanted to play a role. I got the text message that the football players wanted to meet, and I ran to get there, said Ruben Thallergy, a Mizzou graduate student and one of the original 11 activists who founded Concerned Student 1950. This could be their chance, the activists knew. This would be their moment. The movement's presence on Mizzou's campus had begun 3 months earlier thanks to the work of 3 women, all University of Missouri seniors. The trio was gathered in Naomi Doherty's campus apartment in August of 2014 when they decided they had to do something. Doherty, Ashley Bland, and Callian Beck were angered and hurt as they watched their Twitter and Instagram feeds flood with images of the spot in Ferguson where Michael Brown had been shot and killed by a police officer. Like many of the Mizzou black students, Beck had grown up in St. Louis, and she was getting most of her updates not from social media outlets, but from the posts of high school friends and family members who had arrived in Ferguson to protest. A lot of my people were literally on the ground where it happened, Beck told me, so I said, why don't we start something together? First, the women started an MU for Mike Brown account on Twitter and Facebook, and they set up an email address. Within an hour, more than 60 students had messaged them to say that they wanted to join the protest group. The group caught fire as students returned to campus, eager to do something about the unrest developing just an hour and a half away from their dorms. The lack of an official statement from university officials on Michael Brown's death only stirred the discord. Enraged by the 18-year-old's death and by what they saw as an inattentiveness by the university administration, MU for Mike Brown was soon hosting vigils, rallies, demonstrations, and most crucially, weekly planning meetings for would-be activists. 2 die-ins, during which participants lie flat on the ground in public spaces held on campus, drew hundreds of participants. Many, including Butler, traveled to Ferguson to participate in the protests there. But the newfound racial activism came as the nation and the state of Missouri remained bitterly divided about the events in Ferguson. In November of 2014, as the grand jury concluded that the evidence did not support the indicting officer Darren Wilson, a new round of riots began in Ferguson, and with them declarations of "we told you so" from those skeptical of the growing protest movement. The president of the police union in Columbia, Missouri, organized a Darren Wilson Day in honor of the police officer who killed Michael Brown. Dozens of students took to Yik Yak, an anonymous message board app popular on college campuses, to decry the protests. They were calling us monkeys and, I hate saying this word, and then word, said Ashley Bland, one of the MU for Mike Brown founders. It was blatant. It wasn't even a hidden racism. In early December, after the grand jury's decision, a popular campus nightclub gave out wristbands that read "Hands Up, Pants Up." The establishment said it was a play on their dress code, while activists saw it as a mockery of a popular protest chant. The following Friday, at least 90 students protested outside the nightclub, blocking traffic and chanting. The nightclub apologized in a Facebook post. Those protest actions, the counter-protests, and the clashes between those 2 mobilized groups were symbolic of what was to come. As the daily vigils in Ferguson and Baltimore began to wane, the mantle was soon taken up on campuses across the country. Young men and women saw themselves in the protest leaders and in the names and faces of the men and women who had been killed by police. Mizzou student body president Peyton Head, 21, could barely remember what day it was, and his phone wouldn't stop ringing as he wandered into his office late on a Friday night in November of 2015. The room was full of student government colleagues and campus activists. In the past week, they had successfully run out the university president and his boss, the chancellor, had come under vicious attack by political partisans, and in the process, Head had become the new face of black campus activism. Sunk into his chair, Head picked at a Chipotle bowl before pausing to look up at the Albert Einstein quote he had written in Mizzou gold above his desk. "The world will not be destroyed by evil, but by those who watch without doing anything." A week earlier, Head had been in Kansas City with activists as they confronted university student Tim Wolf outside a fundraiser. University president Tim Wolf outside a fundraiser. Head had worked closely with Wolf and liked him, and up until that point, he had thought the president might be able to calm the anger of the black student body while retaining his job. When Wolf tried and failed to explain to activists what systemic oppression was, Head changed his mind. If the university president could not adequately define and explain the role of systemic oppression, how would he effectively lead a university to address it? It was clear that Tim Wolf hadn't been listening to his own students. Head had been elected on a platform that emphasized inclusion, and most of his prior campus government work had centered around issues of diversity, social justice, and equity. A year after he had become the public spokesperson for the student body, his on-campus office was overflowing with university apparel, the walls and counters covered in pictures, one from his White House fellowship, one each from meetings with Senators Claire McCaskill and Roy Blunt, and the official photo from his Run for President student body, which included his campaign slogan, boldly across the top, "Believe with us, ignite Mizzou." The slogan was taken from a speech by the school's chancellor to mark the university's 175th anniversary, given near the historic columns that stand on campus, which that night were illuminated by bright lights resembling flames. "Keep the fire rolling," the chancellor implored. Head took the urging to heart. Raised in Chicago, Head first visited Mizzou because his twin sister was interested in the journalism school. They both fell in love with the campus and were soon enrolled. Head loved his classmates in Columbia, but soon found himself unnerved time and time again by the stories he'd heard from fellow black students. Many upperclassmen had tales of being confronted by drunken men with Confederate flags. A close friend of Head's showed up at a party at a fraternity house, only to be told she couldn't come in. Only white girls were welcome, they explained to her. She transferred. In 2013, the spring of his sophomore year, Head was walking through Greektown, the stretch of fraternity and sorority houses near campus, when a group of white kids sitting in the back of a pickup truck began screaming the N-word at him. "At that moment, I didn't know what to do," Head said. "My high school was like 87% black. I didn't know how to deal with racism blatantly being thrown in my face." It's the kind of story that many of Mizzou's black students say they too can tell. Dewy-eyed freshmen get the same warning from campus elders in Mizzou's black community. "It's going to happen to you. Just wait." That fall at Mizzou, activists participated in a series of other less race-based protests against sexual assault on campus, the defunding of Planned Parenthood, and the decision by President Wolf to cut health care for graduate students. But above all, the semester-long protests were propelled by a series of racial incidents on campus that began when, in September, Head was again confronted by a pickup truck. Head was walking along with a friend late one night on their way to the cookie shop in downtown Columbia when a pickup truck drove up and the white men inside began screaming the N-word at them. What made me most angry about that situation was the fact that I had been working on inclusion initiatives this entire year, Head said. "I'm getting to the end of my time in office and I'm still seeing the same things." Head took to Facebook, writing an impassioned post about the incident, calling for change on campus. It was unacceptable, the student body president declared, that nearly every black student he knew on campus had a similar story. Something, he said, had to change. "I didn't realize the platform that was out there," Head said. Like Martise Johnson, he had ascended to roles of power and privilege on campus and had realized his personal responsibility to speak up in the face of injustice. If Peyton had posted this being a sophomore from Chicago, everybody would be like, okay, that's bad. But Peyton, posting from the privilege of the MSA, or Missouri Students Association, president's office, there's a platform where people actually listen, had told me. The post went viral. It was shared hundreds of times, prompting media coverage from both local and national outlets. But it still took 6 days before the campus administration addressed the incident, calling Head and asking him if he would help write the chancellor's statement. The campus activists decided they'd had enough. 4 days after Head's incident, 3 students, Ayanna Poole, Deshania Ware, and Jonathan Butler, issued a call to action to 60 student leaders. 8 people responded, and the group of 11 decided they would confront Chancellor R. Bowen Lofton and President Wolf at homecoming. We have this dangerous culture of apathy where things aren't being addressed, Butler said. If leadership wasn't going to do something, we had to do something. At the homecoming parade, the group surrounded Wolf's car, linking arms and launching into speeches decrying the racial attacks and declaring they felt unsafe on campus. The university president didn't talk to the students, and police soon arrived to disperse them. The activists were shocked that the president hadn't gotten out of the car to speak with them. In the days that followed, the activists assumed Wolf would reach out to them to smooth things over and discuss what had happened. He didn't. The inaction dismayed student leaders. Head called the president's office himself, privately urging Wolf to reach out to the student group and make amends. His pleas were ignored. Every day we had to wait for him to respond was another slap in the face, Ruben Philoggi said. After more than a week, the students from the homecoming protest set up a meeting with members of the administration themselves. The protests earned the support of large swaths of the student body, but they certainly weren't without detractors. Several pre-existing activist groups on campus didn't like the tactics of the 11 students, who then formed Concerned Student 1950. Even among the university's black student body, some thought, and still think, that everything was being blown out of proportion. I've heard of a couple of racial incidents, but I don't think it necessarily warrants a hunger strike, said Rodney McFall, a junior at Mizzou who is black and who, like me, grew up in Shaker Heights, Ohio. He reached out to me when he heard I was headed to campus to cover the unrest. I'm not sure what removing the president of the university will do to combat racism on campus. No administrator is going to be able to convince students not to be racist. To be clear, McFall wasn't alone in his skepticism. To critics and many white Americans, the campus push to oust President Wolf represented what McFall observed, an overreaction to a series of unrelated racial incidents that no administrator could have prevented, and which President Wolf was under no obligation to respond to. To supporters and many black Americans, the protest became a decisive victory, a validation of the unsuccessful struggles undertaken by countless others before them. And to organizers, activists, and observers of the ongoing Black Lives Matter social justice movement, the upending of the state's most prominent and beloved college campus represented the next chapter in the still accruing legacy of Ferguson, Missouri. The taking up of the protest mantle on these campuses marked a new evolution for the movement, as black men and women who would have had the privilege of staying at home and off the streets were overcome with the urgency of the moment. From Ferguson to Mizzou, it was fitting that Missouri played such a crucial role in the nation's new reckoning with race and justice. The state sits near the exact geographic center of the nation, pulled at one time between the free states to the north and its fellow slave states to the south. It was here that a court handed down the infamous Dred Scott decision, ruling that a black man was not, in fact, in the eyes of our nation, a man with inalienable rights. It's been a long boil, said Scott Brooks, a Mizzou sociology professor who spoke at several of the 2014 rallies. Students felt like they weren't being heard, and the university wasn't taking them seriously. And in a post-Ferguson world, increasingly, the students felt the mantra of all deliberate speed. The headlines flowing out of Columbia reawoke and enraged many black alumni who saw in those anecdotes an experience that was all too familiar. Many of us found ourselves protesting similar incidents on campus. A group of more than 780 black alumni wrote in an open letter in early November of 2015. We find it highly unacceptable that many of these issues are not only still continuing, but have become more pervasive. The letter outlined a list of incidents dating back to 2004, when a student wrote a piece for the campus newspaper blaming black students for vandalism, and recalled an incident in 2010 when 2 white students threw cotton balls at the lawn of the Black Culture Center. After the cotton ball incident, and with university officials considering a proposal to end affirmative action policies at state universities, black leaders on campus desperately approached the athletic teams. This response was lackluster, recalled Anthony Martin, a Mizzou grad, who said that after several attempts, the campus activists essentially gave up on trying to get football and basketball players to join the demonstrations. There just wasn't at that time a lot of camaraderie between student organizations and athletes. But as they walked graduation stages in the early 2010s, Martin's generation looked back at what they had considered an opportunity missed and passed along a message to fraternity brothers and sorority sisters, student government leaders, and campus activists who were coming up behind them. If you can get the athletic department and the student body leadership together, that's a force to be reckoned with, Martin said to me, recalling conversations with Head, who is his fraternity brother, and others. When you mess with someone's money, you mess with their livelihood. If you can get the athletes, the university can't ignore you. Now, buoyed by the boycotting football team, Concerned Student 1950 doubled down on its demands, and the number of activists camped out on the university quad swelled to dozens. Would they be able to pull off the kind of campus shakeup in 2015 that campus activists had desired for more than a decade? But they still weren't sure. President Wolf had told them as recently as the Friday before that he was not going to step down, a sentiment he reiterated in a statement over the weekend. Late Sunday night, with his hunger strike about to enter its 7th day, Jonathan Butler said he had almost no confidence that Wolf would resign. The Mizzou activists, like many of the organizers in Ferguson and elsewhere, communicated constantly using a group text app called GroupMe, firing off hundreds of messages a day in a group they titled "We Gon' Be Alright," after a hip-hop track by Kendrick Lamar that had become the unofficial anthem of this generation of black protesters. Thus far, the victories of Concerned Students 1950 had been few. Butler's hunger strike had yet to gain much national attention. Some other campus activist groups were hesitant to co-sign Concerned Students' tactics. A message on Monday morning summoned the Concerned Student 1950 leaders to another meeting with the football team. The boycott had become the leading story in the nation, and now dozens of additional players, many of them white, wanted to hear from Butler directly. They crowded into a small theater in the university's athletic complex, typically used to review game footage, and Butler took the microphone. I shared with them my reasoning for the hunger strike and why I was doing this, and I also shared with them my experience going back to as an undergrad. In 2008, when I had the N-word written on my door to the cotton ball situation, Butler said, I just explained that through my undergrad career and now as a graduate student, nothing had changed. As the meeting ended, the players decided they would join the protest. They would not play or practice until Butler's demands were met. They gathered around Butler and posed for a picture. Just before noon the next morning, November 9, Butler met with the football team, and his head dashed across campus in search of the Board of Curators meeting for which he was running desperately late. Their phones buzzed with a new message in the group chat. President Wolf had resigned. They had won. When Butler stepped to the microphone Monday afternoon to make his first public appearance since Wolf's resignation, his T-shirt declaring, I love my blackness and yours, a slogan made popular by several national Black Lives Matter activists, he declared his allegiance loud and clear to the movement birthed in Ferguson. When we look at what has been happening on campus in terms of activism with black students, it would be inappropriate if I did not acknowledge the people who got us here, Butler said. When we look at post-Ferguson activism, the movement that was started in terms of igniting the fire with black students was ignited with 3 queer black women who started MU for Mike Brown. By the time I arrived on campus, the Mizzou protesters were struggling to figure out what would happen next. They hadn't exactly been ready to win. They hadn't expected Wolf to resign, at least not as quickly as he had. Now what? What began as a last-ditch personal protest had become one of the recent history's most significant victories for student activism. The throng of media who had come to cover a football team's boycott were instead now scrambling to contextualize a university coup d'etat with roots tracing back through years of unaddressed campus racial tension endured by black students as reliably as the students' white leaders chose to ignore it. Here was a campus protest built to dismantle institutional racism where organizers had first been emboldened by police shooting in a small St. Louis suburb a year earlier. A cloud of chaos would hover over campus for the following week, with the president's resignation prompting clashes between activists and the media about the framing of coverage, as well as about the right of reporters and photographers to access protests held in public space. New conversations started up about race on campus, not just at Mizzou, but at universities nationwide, as did a fresh spate of racial threats, primarily from the same anonymous online trolls who surface each time the nation begins to grapple with race. For at least one night, these threats thrust the nation's black community into a state of traumatized paralysis. Critics couldn't understand the abrupt resignation or the grievances being voiced by the media-shy protest groups. In these young activists, they saw a group who were at best misguided, at worst liars and frauds. These critics demanded definitive proof that racist incidents had occurred. But even as questions were being raised in the national media about whether or not these actions had taken place, similar acts of racial hatred kept happening at Mizzou. In the days after Wolf's resignation, a drunken white man appeared in the middle of campus, yelling threats at students who walked past. Yik-yak message boards filled with violent threats toward black students that prompted hundreds to skip classes and avoid campus. And the sign outside the Black Culture Center was vandalized overnight, the word black covered in spray paint. When that news broke out on the night of Tuesday, November 10th, 2015, more than 100 student leaders were assembled for a once-a-semester joint meeting of student organization heads. As they sat in a conference room, they quickly began spreading the word to their fraternities and sororities and other organizations. State troopers soon arrived at the meeting and escorted the entire group across campus to the Black Culture Center, which had been secured by police. Meanwhile, reports of drunken white students screaming racial slurs at black students had prompted social media hysteria. Most likely they were a handful of foolish, bigoted students out and about that night, but judging by social media, a reasonable person would have assumed that the entire campus was besieged by hooded terrorists. By now, Head had heard from several students that white men claiming to be KKK members were on campus. That was not confirmed, but in the heat of the moment, the rumors felt frightening. Head and others began reaching out to the various law enforcement and civil rights contacts that they had gathered in the subsequent days. School administrators, Jesse Jackson, an official at the Department of Justice, and of course their parents. Head posted a Facebook status urging students to stay inside and away from windows. Dozens of black students poured away from the school, crowding into off-campus apartments. Butler and other activists used their group text to organize carpools. Worried mothers and fathers of black and white students frantically called their freshman and sophomore sons and daughters who stayed holed up in their dorms if they couldn't find a ride off campus. No one was hurt that night, but many were traumatized. Just hours after the triumphant victory, it was a painful return to reality. The resignation of the president hadn't changed the culture of the campus and the state in which they lived. One of the hardest things for many of the activists I interviewed on and off campus was figuring out what should come next. Should they continue to fight? Should they find real jobs? Should they become politicians, gadflies, full-time activists? Equally hard was deciphering what exactly the victories they had earned would mean both in the short term and in the long term. They had run out the top university administrators and forced a campus to acknowledge a discontent it had long ignored among its black student body. But would things actually get better? And what would be the collateral consequences? The following fall, enrollment at Mizzou dropped by 2,600 students, a clear cost stigma associated with the unrest. A few days after Wolf's resignation, Butler and the others led a march through campus. They chanted and cheered, danced and gyrated through campus buildings and the row of fraternity and sorority houses that make up Greektown. It was a defiant display of jubilation, a declaration to their campus that this fight, though seemingly settled, still wasn't over. There was still work left to be done. The march that day ended in an auditorium, the kind that hosts plays and concerts on almost every college campus in America. Gathered by the stage, the 50 or so students who remained, almost all black, stood in a circle, holding hands or with arms over shoulders. Then someone turned on the sound system. For what may have been the millionth time, the beginning chords were heard of All Right. The young activists were soon jumping and dancing to the declaration of perseverance that had become their battle hymn. All's my life I had to fight. I didn't yet know of all the details of the story's end, but as I listened to the jubilant chants and watched as dozens of students jumped and danced in unison, I could feel the truth emanating from the words echoing into the auditorium rafters. We gonna be all right. We gonna be all right. We gonna be all right. Does somebody want to read the afterward?
No, it's I think they'll get the gist of it. It played in my head.
What you say? What you say? What you
It's
say?
the
What you
words
say?
of the song. It's the the hook. Yeah, it's the song.
Sing it.
You know how the song goes.
What you mean? You
This one right here.
It's just the.
Sing the song.
Sing it.
We gonna be alright. What you gonna?
Sing the song.
What you gonna?
Come here.
That's what she was saying, but you gotta sing the song, the whole line. That's how the song goes.
But it does say all right, not I.
Oh, it says all right. Don't say Yeah, I think it is all right in the song. They don't say they pronounce the all pretty hard.
Oh. Do you want to read the afterward?
You want to read afterward? Your voice is so soothing. Like I'm listening to Audible or audiobook or something. I feel like I'd be too.
There's this woman named Phoebe Chandler I used to listen to. She had a podcast. Her voice like that.
Yeah, I know. I feel like I'm too.
So the afterword. 3 days in July. The movement for Black Lives, as activists had begun calling the protest movement, and the national push for police reform had faded from the national consciousness during the first months of 2016, in stark contrast to its constant presence in 2014 and for most of 2015. There were bursts of attention, ongoing fallout in Chicago following the release in late 2015 of the video of Laquan McDonald being shot and killed, and the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. Most significantly, but in each instance, Americans' focus on the race and justice landed like another strong wave, only to recede right back into the ocean. 6 months into 2016, I was fact-checking our latest piece, My colleague Kimberly Kindy and I had analyzed the number of Americans killed to date and discovered that even after more than a year of protest and outrage, police nationwide were on pace to take more lives in 2016 than they had in 2015. Yet none of the men and women killed by police in 2016 had received the same level of attention from the media or had galvanized activists as had those killed just months earlier. The calendar had been predictably dominated by the presidential election, but even there, policing had yet to become a major focus of debate. For racial justice activists, the election was an opportunity to pressure candidates to adopt positions on policing and criminal justice reform, as well as to speak out on other issues of racial disparity. It remained to be seen how successful they would be. Police know that the police are still killing people. What we've got to figure out now is what a victory looks like. Kayla Reed, the Ferguson protester still working for the Organization for Black Struggle in St. Louis, told me in early 2016. There isn't going to be a single bill passed that will suddenly encompass all of the ways the system marginalizes black and brown people. We have to redo the whole damn thing. Many of the young activists who had been driven to the street by the police killings of 2014 and 2015 had begun to move away from daily protesting and organizing work. Kayla Reed and Janetta Elzie had both re-enrolled in college classes. After his run for mayor, DeRay McKesson had rejoined the Baltimore City Schools as an administrator. Sean King, now a New York Daily News columnist, Kwame Rose, and Martise Johnson had all assumed roles as surrogates for the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, rallying voters on his behalf. Don't get Sean King money. Stop giving Sean King money. Stop it. Many of them and others in the movement felt they needed to catch their breath. Robust conversations circulated about the viralization of the deaths of individuals and the fetishization of Black death. Perhaps, some argued, not every video needed to be shared and played on a constant loop. It's traumatic to see a hashtag of someone killed by the police every day. It messes with your psyche, Reed said. And the protest movement is bigger than just the police. How could such a boisterous and seemingly How could a boisterous and seemingly omnipresent protest movement just fade from the streets? Where had the movement for Black life gone? As I finished a round of fact-checking, a tweet from DeRay McKesson with the hashtag Alton Sterling caught my eye. It took me seconds to find the video, shot with a cell phone camera, of Sterling's final moments on July 5th, 2016. Two officers are yelling at him. They tase him, they tackle him, and then the bullets are fired into his chest. The Post has an overnight reporting desk, a team of night owl reporters who handle late-breaking news, so I flagged the shooting for my colleagues to make sure they had seen it. And then I went home to wait. I paced in my living room, and later my bedroom, refreshing Twitter. I found a few thousand people, and with each refresh of my phone, a new group of them were voicing pain, anger, and outrage as they, too, watched the video. We each cope with these deaths differently. I escaped by reporting, making calls, digging into the police department that was involved, and tracking down the friends and family of the slain to better understand how the moment of their death fits within the context of the rest of their life. Doing this keeps my mind busy. Often we all have an urge to do something. For me, reporting is that something. The videos that surface at night are typically the hardest. The night of Sterling's death, I tried to do a little preliminary reporting, but I couldn't. it was too late to call anyone. I set an early alarm, knowing that my job the next day would be to find witnesses, law enforcement officials, and context. And then I lay restless. How do you sleep when you know that soon you'll need to tell the story of the death of yet another black man? I was taken back to the countless days when the fierce urgency surrounding the latest black person killed by the police had dictated my sleep, work, and life. It felt like the night of the video of Walter Scott was released. The afternoon the officer who killed Sam DuBose was charged, and the night the KKK was rumored to be at Mizzou after President Wolf's resignation. When my phone went off, I'd been asleep only minutes. I jolted out of bed. Before I could catch my breath, a frantic day of reporting and writing was already behind me. I stayed in the newsroom until late that night, finalizing our coverage of Sterling's death and the national outrage it had awoken. Sometime around 11 p.m., a friend from college sent me a link to a live Facebook video feed from a woman in Minnesota. An officer had just shot her boyfriend. She screamed. As the camera panned, you could see a dying Philando Castile struggling to seize his final breaths. Over the woman's shoulder stood the officer who had shot him, his gun still trained on the dying man. For the 2 years since Ferguson, it had been more or less my job to bear witness to pain and trauma. Once you're known as a reporter who covers policing and justice, your email accounts and voicemail boxes become depositories of death, pleading messages from mothers and widows of those who have been killed by police officers who beg you to tell their story. Envelopes from inmates stuffed with legal filings and police reports arrived at work addressed to me. As hard as it is to be in receipt of so much rightful pain and sorrow, video of shootings, tasings, arrests, and beatings is difficult. There's no way to filter it. The only way to decide what to cover is to watch them all. To date, the hardest video for me to watch had been the extended version of Tamir Rice's death, in which his sister frantically raced to his body only to be tackled by officers. But even in that video hadn't brought me to tears. The video feed of Diamond Reynolds, Castile's girlfriend, was different. Fuck. I told him not to reach for it. I told him to get his hand out. The officer screams at Reynolds. You told him to get his ID, sir, his driver's license, she insists in response. Oh my God, please don't tell me he's dead. Please don't tell me my boyfriend just went like that. Responding officers eventually removed Reynolds and her 4-year-old daughter from the car where Castile was dying. In the video, as they take her into custody, Reynolds, who up until this point has been unbelievably composed, begins to lose herself to what just happened. She cries and then she prays. She pleads with Jesus, a broken woman begging for divine intervention. As Reynolds then begins to scream, her 4-year-old daughter interjects. It's okay, I'm right here with you. I sprang up from my desk and ran to the newsroom bathroom to throw up. Then I began reporting. Soon I was on the phone with Castile's sister, who was gathered with her family in a Minnesota hospital. She sobbed as she told me the only thing they knew. He's gone. The shootings of Sterling and Castile together prompted a reawakening. Among the cities that hosted major protests was Dallas, where the police had gone to great pains to support the protesters, cordoning off areas for demonstrators and posing for photos next to signs calling for reforms and justice. Unknown to the crowd, a single gunman would soon prey on this gathering, specifically attacking white police officers in what he later told police negotiators was a targeted retribution for the police killings of black men. A week later, another lone wolf attacked officers in Baton Rouge, killing 3. The deaths and injury of the officers in these 2 cities again shook the nation, underscoring with renewed urgency the depth of the anger and distrust towards police still coursing through America. The attacks on police enraged the law enforcement community, who for years had worried about such targeted attacks. In a country with millions of easily accessible guns and an increasing national distrust of institutions, specifically the police, it wasn't hard to imagine the ease with which someone determined to harm officers could carry out such an attack. With a number of police shootings that have occurred that seem to be totally unjustified, somewhere in this country, someone was going to do such a thing. John Cruzat, a former prosecutor and judge in Dallas, told me after the shooting. Civil rights groups and the young activists behind the protests that had propelled the movement quickly condemned the shootings, but opponents of the protest movement blamed the rhetoric of the movement for Black lives for the murders of the officers in Dallas and Baton Rouge. A tactic not unlike the one employed by those who blamed Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders for the riots of the 1960s. After the police attack, President Obama convened a 33-person conference at the White House, a conversation that ran for 4.5 hours, which the president told attendees was among the longest single-subject conferences of his presidency. The attendees were a mix: young activists like DeRay McKesson, civil rights stalwarts like Al Sharpton, police chiefs and heads of several major police unions, and government officials including Attorney General Loretta Lynch. The president lived up to his reputation as a former law professor, NAACP President Cornell William Brooks told me after the meeting. He spent quite a bit of time listening, probing, and guiding the discussion, occasionally deploying the Socratic method to get some of the day's best responses. Among the first exchanges was between St. Paul Mayor Chris Coleman, who sharply defended his officers' actions in response to massive protests that had broken out after the death of Philando Castile, and Mika Grimm, a local Black Lives Matter protest who had been leading the demonstrations. Coleman called some of the protesters disgraceful, while Grimm shot back that it was their democratic duty to take to the streets and the democratic obligation of the police to protect them. I responded by telling him that the protests aren't going to stop until we see actual change, Grimm told me later, and that begins with seeing an officer held accountable for killing somebody. I'd first met Grimm months earlier when I traveled to Minneapolis to cover the demonstrations in Minneapolis after the police shooting of Jamar Clark, an unarmed black man. As I followed a parade of marchers, Grimm was seated in the back of a pickup truck near the front, shouting protest chants into a bullhorn. But she spoke more softly in the White House. This was her first trip to Washington, D.C., much less to the White House. As she sparred with the mayor and the police chief of her city, she received an unexpected expression of support. One of the other police chiefs in the room slid her a handwritten note, written on a sheet from a White House notepad. "Don't be deterred from speaking truth to power," read the note, written by Dean Esserman, the chief of the New Haven Police Department. When it was his turn to speak, DeRay McKesson drilled into Obama with a long list of complaints. He told the president that the language he used to describe the protesters had come a long way, but he implored Obama to stop sprinkling into his speeches and addresses to black audiences urgings to vote. As McKesson explained it, many in the community interpreted Obama's exhortations as condescending and reductionist. McKesson asked the president to tell the FBI to stop having its agents drop in the homes of prominent activists In the weeks before the Republican and Democratic conventions, Janetta Elsie, Bree Newsom, McKesson himself, and at least half a dozen other prominent activists were visited by federal agents, which they believed to be an attempt to intimidate them. And, McKesson noted, the president had been quick to visit Dallas after the officers were killed there, but even 2 years later had yet to set foot in Ferguson. "Well, I'm glad you have a long list for me," the president quipped in response. As he facilitated the conversation, Obama often glanced to his left at Brittany Packnett, a 31-year-old Ferguson protester and Campaign Zero co-founder who speaks with unwavering confidence and poise. This was at least the third time Packnett had met with Obama, who, after one meeting, had been so struck by her command of the room that he pulled her aside to encourage her to one day run for office. Her father, Ronald Packnett, had been a prominent black minister and activist in St. Louis before dying in 1996 at the age of 45. Her mother, Gwendolyn Packnett, remains a well-known educator, community leader, and philanthropist. "My dad was an amazing activist, and Mom has always been in community leadership," Packnett recalls. "So, truth be told, my first protest was probably while I was still in a stroller." Packnett recalls a childhood of relative privilege. Her parents, who had both grown up in households with meager means, had worked to ensure that their children could have the things they hadn't. They lived in a nice section of St. Louis, drove good cars, and went to esteemed private schools. But Packnett recalls being raised with a double consciousness, having access to money and privilege, but also feeling deep pride in her identity as a black woman and as a black Christian. She read the autobiography of Malcolm X and sat patiently next to her parents at evening Bible studies. "Our social responsibility was the most important thing," Packnett told me about her upbringing, "and I was raised in liberation theology. We worshipped a table-flipping revolutionary Jesus with brown skin and afro hair." One evening, when she was 8 years old, her father and younger brother came bursting through the front door, her brother in tears. They had been out for a drive and had gotten pulled over. As the officer approached the vehicle, he had asked Mr. Packnett to step out of the car, and then thrown him onto the hood and put him in handcuffs. The officer didn't believe that this black man could possibly own the Mercedes he was driving. The entire family was outraged, and Packnett's brother was traumatized. Her father, who was among the most politically connected black men in St. Louis, called the police chief and demanded that the officer apologize personally in front of his son. As she grew older, Packnett became an outspoken minority in her predominantly white private schools, sprinkling her class assignments with asides about equity and racial justice and helping to organize a regular seminar on diversity and inclusion. That drew backlash in the hallways of her majority white school. She recalls that one particular student, a young white man from a prominent local family who was a year ahead of her, began following Packnett around the hallways, mocking her. "Is my whiteness oppressing you today?" he would ask as she moved from class to class. She would ignore him. Then, one day, she didn't. She turned around just outside the women's locker room and told him to stop speaking to her that way. In return, he spit in her face. Packnett said her track coach, one of her mentors in high school, insisted she tell the principal, who forced the boy to apologize. Immediately, the memory of her late father's interaction with the officer who pulled him over flashed back into her mind. That officer, like this boy, had been made to apologize, but had either actually been held accountable, or did the system send the message that abuse of a black boy can be negated and papered over by an "I'm sorry," no matter how reluctantly uttered? It's this idea that all a person had to do was say, "I'm sorry," and then they never had to be held accountable for their actions, Packnett said. Thinking about those two incidents is, for me, a constant reminder that this system was never built for us in the first place. In the years since, Packnett had occupied a seat at some tables at which her parents had sat, her activism undeterred by that incident. In college, at Washington University in St. Louis, she organized demonstrations and rallies on behalf of the campus food workers, ultimately helping them win their first across-the-board wage increase in years. By the time Michael Brown was killed, she was working as an executive director for Teach for America, St. Louis, spending many days in meetings with donors. She saw herself as an inside-the-room advocate for radical change. I had let a certain amount of comfort and privilege take hold of my social work justice, she said. I wasn't sacrificing my body very much anymore in physical protests. That changed in August 2014 when she showed up outside the Ferguson Police Department a few days after Michael Brown was killed. With demonstrations swelling beneath the summer sun, some city leaders invited Packnett inside the police station for a private meeting with the chief. It was the type of convening that often occurs in the days after a shooting. The powers that be assemble a group of black leaders, insist they're doing everything they can, and request that these leaders help cool the crowds. We see that in Rockford. This time, Packnett said no. She wouldn't attend the meeting. She was staying outside. Sitting in a room with a corrupt police chief inside a building while traumatized black people protested outside was not the right step, Packnett recalled. It was time to stop sitting in the ivory tower and hypothesizing and actually get back to what I knew in my spirit and in my upbringing was necessary to change these policing systems. By the end of the week, she was a protest regular. But soon enough, the movement would call on her to sit at the table again. She applied for and was accepted to a spot on the Ferguson Commission, the task force convened by Missouri Governor Jay Nixon after the unrest in 2014. Next, impressed after meeting her at the first sit-down with young activists who had been awakened in Ferguson, President Obama invited Packnett to join his president's task force on 21st century policing. Everyone has a role, Packnett said after the post-Dallas White House meeting. There are some people who need to be the revolutionary, and there are some people who need to be at the table in the White House. And I knew it was my job to translate the pain I had seen and experienced in the streets and bring it into the halls of power. Packnett explains the protest movement as a series of escalating waves. Its conception from the deaths of Oscar Grant, Trayvon Martin, and Jordan Davis, which mobilized black Americans in a demand for justice. Its grand birth, first in Ferguson and then throughout the nation in the fall of 2014, was prompted by the deaths of Eric Gardner, John Crawford, and Michael Brown, the cases that showed those same black Americans that justice for those killed by the police was not forthcoming. As the list of names grew, each week, each day providing another, so did the urgency of the uprising that would become a movement. The year 2015 brought a third wave of anger and pain. Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, Sam DuBose, another round of death in which the now pained calls for police accountability became insistent demands. The year 2016, which began sleepily, quickly saw the beginning of what most likely will become a fourth wave. As President Obama prepares to leave the White House, it remains to be seen whether the movement birthed by the broken promise of his presidency will live on through the season of his successor. The protest will continue, Packnett said confidently when I called her from Cleveland on the first night of the Republican National Convention in July. regardless of who is elected, we're going to continue to work. Regardless of who is elected, we're going to work to continue this level of engagement with the next administration. There's just too much at stake. While the targeted killings of the officers in Dallas and Baton Rouge prompted some commentators and other members of the media to declare the movement for Black Lives dead, the activists and organizers who have been the foot soldiers have not gone quietly into the night. A few days later came the non-fatal shooting in North Miami of behavioral therapist Charles Kinsey, who was lying on the ground with his hands in the air, begging not to be shot as he tried to soothe his autistic patient when an officer fired his gun 3 times. Kinsey's hands were up. He yelled, "Don't shoot," and the officer fired anyway. I was thinking, as long as I have my hands up, they're not going to shoot me, Kinsey told local television station WSVN from his hospital bed. Wow, was I wrong. In the days after the deaths of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile, thousands of people used an online tool provided by the Campaign Zero to petition their local elected officials to demand police reform. Just before July 18th, as the political media gathered in Cleveland for the GOP convention, thousands of demonstrators took to the streets in more than 30 cities across the nation in a weekend of activism they titled Freedom Now. We have no choice but to keep going, Packnet told me. If one of the central demands of the movement is to stop killing us, and they're still killing us, then we don't get to stop either. July 2016, Cleveland. There's an acknowledgements section, and I think just because we... Huh? Well, I'm gonna read it because I think it's educational. I'm going to read it personally because a lot of these people, especially like Bree Newsom, Kwame Rose, some other names stick out to me as prominent activists, and so I think that it would be productive for people to kind of look into who these people are and the kinds of work that they're doing and how they're succeeding or what they're doing that's holding them back or, where they're making progress. So I'm going to read that, the acknowledgement section. To the families and friends of those who in death have become national figures, Rorschach tests in a divided nation's debate of race and justice, thank you for sharing your pain, your mourning, and your humanity with the nation, and for extending patience and love to reporters like me who have shown up at your door at life's worst moments. In the acknowledgments of his first book, journalist Chris Hayes described Vanessa Mobley as his intellectual co-pilot. I heard from Chris almost as soon as I signed with Vanessa, letting me know how lucky I was to have landed the best editor in the game. By then, I already knew. Her brilliance lies in her ability to reveal to me the things I knew but could never have said, to access the understanding I possess but never could have otherwise voiced. Her diligence and intellect forced me to heights that I could not have fathomed when we began. It has been an honor to co-pilot this project with her. This book never would have made it into Vanessa's arms had it not been guided by an amazing team. Thank you to Molly Glick, for forcing me to sit down and write the original proposal for this book, even when I didn't think I could or wanted to. Anthony Matero, the literary agent and friend, has pushed pushed me and this project forward. Thank you to my agent, Tracy Wilkes-Smith, and the entire team at CSE for believing and building in me. The heartbeat of this project and the young people whose stories occupy its pages. For 2 years, they have answered my calls, responded to my inquiries, indulged my theories, and helped me understand the depth of this moment. Without their stories, their work, and their candor and willingness to share both with me, there would be no book. There's bugs. It's getting so nice. There's bugs. No, that's my spot. To Janetta Elzie, Alexis Templeton, Kayla Reed, DeRay McKesson, Brittany Packnett, Clifton Kinney, Bree Newsome, Kwame Rose, Sean King, stop giving money to him, Jonathan Butler, Peyton Head, Martise Johnson, telling your stories has been an honor. And the many names and stories may not grace these pages, but whose work has nonetheless driven this moment and whose words and actions have crafted and challenged my understanding of what activism can be. People like Rachel Smith, Dante Berry, Samuel Sinyangwe, Mervyn Marcano, Michael Skolnick, and the folks at the Advancement Project, and the too often unsung Chelsea Fuller, my sister, confidant, and North Star. Contextualizing the events of the last 2 years would have been impossible without conversations with people far smarter than I am. Chris King, Khalil Muhammad, Phil Goff, Ryan Jolison, Chuck Wexler, Neil Pierce, for sharing with me notes from his study of St. Louis, and many others. I've been blessed with parents who love me and have spent close to 3 decades sacrificing themselves to provide for me and my younger brothers. My mother, Sheila, will always be the love of my life and the person I spend the most time trying to make proud. My father, Mark, has forever been my role model of what it means to be a journalist, an advocate for diversity, a Christian, and a man. Above my desk hangs an email he sent me in 2013 during what was for me a moment of frustration. A journalist's commitment is to the truth. We have no control over how people choose to handle the truth. I cannot imagine having a more supportive family, both immediate and extended. You all are the rock on which I stand and have provided the grounding of love, faith, and perseverance in which I'm planted. I could never properly articulate what the love and support of my friends has meant to me during these last 2 years. This list is far from complete. Clinton Yates, Freeman Thompson, Travis Waldron, Sam McCullough, Aaron Edwards, John Ketchum, Garrett Kennedy, Eric Burse, Dexter Mullins, Sarah Hoy, Corey Dade, Swati Sharma, Ashley Lutz, John Gruber, Kristen Gassman, Adrian Walker, Joe Ragazzo, Amanda Lucci, Tom Sudis, Colin Jackson, Teddy Cahill, Mike Young, Chris Call, Corey Hayek, Martin Powers, Julian Benbow, Sarah Cavender, Bartice Cox, Juan Diaz Granados.
Hey, did that. That was nice.
I didn't take it in. And the 2012 LA Times Met Pro class. Danielle, thank you for being my partner in taking over the world. Never stop being you. Every reporter is a team project compiled in construction by the editors, colleagues, and competition he or she encounters along the way. I owe my love for journalism to Natalie Sekicki, my first boss, editor, and debate sparring partner. I'll always thank Marcia Joff for teaching a loudmouth high school boy that sometimes it is okay to shut up and listen. Much of this book leans on reporting and writing I've done at the Washington Post. I'll be forever indebted to editors who believed in and bet on me. Kevin Morita, oh God, there's so many names. Tracy Grant, Stephen Ginsburg, Terrence Samuel, Marcia Davis, Vanessa Williams, Lori Montgomery, David Fallis, Scott Wilson, Cameron Barr, and Marty Barron. Kimberly Kindy and Kimbrielle Kelly are the two older sisters that I never knew I wanted, but without whom I'd be lost. Julie Tate, Jen Jenkins, and Stephen Rich. So much of my journalism in these last 2 years would have been impossible without you. To the journalists whose work make me better and whom I am privileged to consider friends, Brittany Noble Jones, Matt Pierce, Yamichi Alcindor, Nicole Hannah Jones, Aaron Wack, and your husband and Ginger, Joel Anderson, Adam Serwer, Jamil Bowie, Darren Sands, Jelani Cobb, Greg Howard, Trymaine Lee, Jamila Lamo, Jamil Smith, Van Newkirk, Clint Smith, Rembert Brown, Ryan Kelly. This book is dedicated to 3 men gone too soon who helped mold me into who I am today. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to love and be loved by as many people as you were and are. And that is the end. And again, I went through that last part. Just it said a lot of different names, but it did talk about some of the activists that told their stories, and had their words written into this book, and had their ideas written into this book, and their views written into this book. And so I think some of them stuck out to me. Some of them I hadn't known about. DeRay McKesson, I hadn't heard that name before, so that one's new to me. But that's definitely somebody that I'm gonna check out to see. They said that he was doing a lot of work, that he was pretty prominent. Bree Newsom was one that stuck out. Kwame Rose was one that stuck out. Sean King, that's a one that a lot of people know, even though you should stop giving him money. Please stop giving him money. That's my bag, and I'm gonna stay in it. But yeah, a lot of these names, a lot of these people do a lot of good work and a lot of good activism, and I think that every little bit helps. And so all of the work that these people are doing is definitely contributing to this movement and helping us progress in our communities and progress as a nation. So, check out what they're doing, as long as you're, educating yourself, and as long as you're listening to us read these books, and as long as you're going out and, buying the books to read yourself like that. I think you should always take initiative to go a little further into seeing the kind of, hands-on or behind the scenes or in the streets or at the table kind of work that people are doing, so we can either replicate that or say, maybe that's something we should not do. It didn't work out for other people. That's not something that we should model our work after. But all of these names that I've said here, they're very clearly doing good work, and so I would definitely take a look at those people and see what you can do in their image to further this movement and to educate yourself. And that's the end of that. It's the end of the book. It's the end of They Can't Kill Us All. Oh, it's gonna fly away. Okay. Oh. Okay. There we go. 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 Oh wait, before we end, just a reminder, if there's anybody watching, I don't think there is, but if there's anybody that watches it, 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock. We're doing the memorial refreshal. We're gonna be down here. They're taking them down now. We're gonna put up fresh new ones, and then we're gonna have. No.
What if people all know?
Nobody's taking them down. They're just gonna be put back up.
Yeah. We're. What's up, man?
All right, we're gonna end this live.
Okay, bye.